Today I'm speaking with Keith Neylon. I have to say that researching Keith's life and reading his book has been tiring even for me, because he's had a 50-year career that doesn't seem to have stopped even for a second. By the age of 19 he had worked as a farmer, a coal miner, a shearer, and had a commercial pilot license. Since then he's been an ag pilot, worked in the venison helicopter industry for 13 years, and started various hugely successful sunrise businesses including Mussel Farming, Salmon farming, and sheep milking with Blue River Dairy. His experiences and stories from those crazy venison recovery days in the 70s and 80s to me are just amazing. But whether you're into farming, hunting, flying, or an entrepreneur, I'm sure you'll find this story interesting. I have to say the interview is a bit of a marathon though, in a good way. So I'd recommend you make a nice hot cup of tea, sit down in front of the fire and settle in for the long haul. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. The first question that came into my mind after reading your book is, why the hell does he do all this stuff? And I suppose the question is, what drives an entrepreneur? Because most of us, and I know me, every chapter I'm exhausted reading it because there's just hurdles and trials and dramas and, I just keep wondering what drives them in people like this to keep going. And I'm assuming it's not the money. What drove you all those years?
Yeah, I think it's your sense of adventure in some respects. But for me, I suppose it was where I was born and the fact that I had a great upbringing. And younger years, life was an adventure. We had so much freedom to pursue our own interests. And, who said, if you had your life over again, would you change anything? Well, that's one thing I definitely wouldn't change. Being brought up in a little coal mining town called Nightcaps, and the freedom that we had and the fun that we had sort of builds up, I suppose, a sense of adventure inside your head. One of the things that it did do for me is, and I didn't realize till, you're partway through life, is that I have a bit of a passion for what you would call sunrise industries. So if it hasn't been done, or hadn't been done, let's have a look at it and see if there's an opportunity.
That's what you call a sunrise industry. If no one's tried it before, you're the first to get into it.
Yeah, well, and I suppose in the first instance, I was always going to be a pilot, from when I was 4 years old. When my uncle took me for a ride in a little old Oster, an Erica, located in a paddock just outside Nightcaps. And to this day, I remember it. And so that was the first adventure. And it was like stepping outside your own environment. To me, you've got three environments. You're land-based, okay. That's part of it. So the next adventure has got to be the sea. We're not fish, but to go to sea says that you're actually going to work in that other environment. But the one that was most challenging, I suppose, and looked like was the best sense of adventure was aviation.
And I guess the venison, we'll get onto all this later, but the venison was almost a sunrise industry too, wasn't it? Especially the live capture.
Yeah, well, when I look back now, it was a sunrise industry because I didn't realize it until I got into it. But here was a product, a very good product, deer, no natural predators. So they'd exploded, and hence government and our system at the time was trying to reduce the numbers. And all of a sudden, you turned that into an export product, and it became very valuable. And so here was the biggest farm in New Zealand. So in the first instance, it says, what a magnificent resource. And it was being wasted. Animals were being shot and left. And so you went from there all the way through processing into a market. And I just looked at the numbers. venison was worth far more than sheep and cattle at the time, so why not? And then it leads you. I was an ag pilot. That's all I ever wanted to be. Just wanted to be an ag pilot. And then to get the opportunity of go fly a helicopter. And at the beginning, 1970, next minute here you are, chasing deer around the mountains of New Zealand.
So you think you're always attracted to the something new and something that hadn't been done and maybe people said couldn't be done. It's sort of...
Yes, and it's not until later on you realise. I know that I got invited to an aviation conference in Auckland. Couldn't understand it. But when, we arrived there, and here we are sitting on the top table, and there's Russell Gutzlag and a few of the guys that I used to know. There was 10 of us, and we were considered pioneers. That had never, ever registered in my head. A pioneer, hell, Bill Hewitt and the rest of them, they started off. But you were part of the initial growth.
And that's interesting because, looking back, it seems like it must have been so obvious you were pioneers at the time. But when you're in that time, it's not obvious. You're just out there doing something new.
Out there doing something new, having great fun. And for me, I suppose if I look back, I have one regret. I didn't stay ag flying for long enough. I never quite got it out of my system. And if I have a look at what we were running around in, a Cessna ag wagon, hell, that was a gift from God. That was just something absolutely brilliant. But if I have a look at what the boys are flying around in now, massive difference from where we came from to where it is today. So you were at the start of it, and it just built that sense inside you.
In your book, which is a great read, by the way, I don't think you can buy it anymore, can you? But it's a great read. But in your book, you talked about your battles with your father as a young teenager. And you said that that's your dad, knew the more he told me I couldn't do something, the more determined I would be to prove him wrong, how right he was. And I just wondered, as I read through the book, that if that mentality became ingrained in you from a teenager throughout your life, so that now it's in your DNA and you just had to try and do what the rest of us wouldn't even dream of.
Well, that was part of it. To me, it wasn't until I, finished off my commercial pilot's course and became a commercial pilot that I recognised that the old man had actually conned me. Because the more he said I couldn't do it, the fact that I walked out of school at 15 because I was totally bored, and then told him that I was going to become a pilot, and he seemed okay with it for a start. He thought I'd probably get it out of my system, wouldn't carry on with it. But then the argument started when I said, I was going to sell everything up and go to Auckland, become a commercial pilot. Well, that was a battle. And it wasn't until I arrived home and my mother picked me up from the airport and, heading back out to the village of Nightcaps. And I said to her, where's Dad? You'll see. I got home and found out here he is, up front, lying in bed, recovering from a massive night on the alcohol. Mum told me he'd been celebrating for the week with his mates the fact that I'd actually become a pilot. And then I thought about him and I thought, you old shit, you conned me.
Yeah, so he's secretly proud of you, he just couldn't tell you.
Couldn't tell me until such time as I'd achieved it.
Mm.
And I suppose he ingrained that. And, it was part of his DNA.
Mm. Your book, which is called A Touch of Madness, most of us don't have that. Well, at least I don't, and I think most of us don't have the dogged determination just to overcome the hurdles and the challenges that you just came up against day after day, especially in your business career. And I just wonder if there is an element of madness or doggedness, or maybe something either illogical that you have to have in order to succeed in that world.
Yeah. Well, I had an Irish partner called Murphy in the UK and one of the businesses.
I'm going to talk about him or ask about him.
Well, I heard him say once when we were, trying to break our way into the food industry in the UK, he said to us, he said, "This is a touch of madness." And then when I put it together, the book, I was walking, it was down in Craig's in Invercargill, a printing company, walking between the aisles with this girl who'd just sort of edited it all up, sorted it out. She said, "You haven't got a title for it." She said, "What are you going to call it?" And as we were walking between the aisles, I just looked at her and I said, "Well, when I read it, it just feels like a touch of madness." And she said, "What a great title." So hence that was it.
Yeah, right.
A touch of madness.
So you mentioned you were brought up in Nightcaps, the Southland town of Nightcaps. Your dad was a coal miner, as were, I guess, many men in the area. And you said this about Nightcaps: "Time is a beautiful thing, as it gives you a chance to look back on history and value all the activities you've been involved in, places you've visited, experience gained, and places you've lived. Without a doubt, my fondest memories are of Nightcaps and the time spent there during my formative years." Can you just briefly describe what your upbringing was like and what most kids ended up doing for a career there? And the reason I ask is because I think it's probably a very different upbringing to what a lot of kids have these days. And it probably it definitely formed your psyche for what you've done over the next 50 or 60 years.
Well, I suppose that for a start off, it's your education, and it might be your parents' attitude towards education. I can remember throwing a sickie at one point in time, and my mother grabbed me and said, "That's it. I don't think you're sick." But no, that's fine. Back to bed. So I'm lying in bed about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and it's cold, and I'm thinking, hell, this is great, I'm going to try it again. That was fine. All the kids come home from school and they're out playing, and I thought, oh, now it's time to get up, I'm okay. I went to get up. Of course, my father had come home from the mines, took one look at me, he said, "No, you're sick, you stay there." So I sat looking out the window, watching everybody having a great time, and thought, well, that's the first lie I've told, and I probably deserve the outcome. That night there was movies on in the local theatre. Of course, my brothers and everybody else go off to the movies. "Oh, I'm okay now, I've come." "Right, no, you're not, you're still sick." That was a massive lesson, and I've never forgot it. I'm well into my 70s now, and it still sits with me. So there was that, and it was, the support I suppose they gave me as a kid, from sport to education all the way through. And again, it was the freedom. We were free to have what adventure we liked. As long, we come home from school and that's it. We'd disappear into the scrub and the bush that surrounded the area, and as long as we're home by dark. So I don't see that sort of freedom in kids now. So we were allowed to exercise our brains and have our adventures.
Yeah.
From horses to huts, and it was just a magnificent time.
And it was obviously a very rural background, so you're very familiar with horses and sheep, which sort of again is what you became involved in later on in your career.
Yes, well, we all had horses. We were riding, we were building huts, we were doing all sorts of things. So you were exercising your mind all the time.
Yeah, and
it was just that background.
I look back on people with upbringings like that, and there's a bit of jealousy there, that. So I guess in rural backgrounds still, in rural communities, it's still like that to some extent, but people in the cities definitely don't get that freedom.
Well, it was, to me, I can remember seeing my father coming in from work, lying on the couch reading the paper, going to sleep, and looking at him and thinking, hey, he's an old man. He was 43, so he was a young man. But the whole town was young. It was full of young people, and there was lots of kids. And so I think we all experienced that sort of freedom. So if I have a look at the men that you grew up in or amongst, great sportsmen, you know. Next door to us, Kevin Laidlaw, an All Black. If you had a look at the rugby team, a lot of the senior players had played for Southland. Golf, everything that you wanted to do, you could do, and you had full support. And you were encouraged and teased and wound up. It was no use crying, because you just got a kick in the ass basically and told to get on with it, and you did.
Yeah. So you left school at 15.
15, yeah. I got incredibly bored,
Mm.
and I had an attitude that I looked at it. I can remember walking. My father went absolutely nuts. So did my mother, and I dare say that was some of the determination.
And what did you go and do?
Finished up working on a farm, and Father said, and in the end, he could see that I wasn't going to go back. And as I said, it was a real battle. He said, well, that's fine, but you're not going down the mines. So,
because he was a coal miner.
He was a miner, and so was my grandfather. You know, both sides of the family were miners.
But you ended up in the coal mines after a year anyway, didn't you?
Yes, yeah. Well, I had to con him.
Was that something you wanted to do, or there was money in it? Or?
No, it was money, because I'm sitting on around about £11 a week, and a couple of my mates working in the coal mines, and they were getting about £30 a fortnight or whatever it was. They had money to go and buy the odd dozen of beer, and I had nothing. And my mother was taking half that anyway. She was going to save it for me. So that's no good. And I wanted to fly.
Right.
And I thought
the coal mines wasn't going to be a permanent thing for you. It was a means to an end.
It was a means to an end. It provided me with the cash. My uncle was a wing commander in the Air Force, and because I had always talked about aviation, he says, you know, why don't you join the Air Force? Stay at school, join the Air Force. I looked at that and thought, no, not enough aircraft. 2, I had to sign on for something like 8 to 10 years. At that age, it was a lifetime. There was no way in hell I was ever going to give that amount of time to anybody and try and control what I wanted to do. So for me, fastest route through was to do it myself. So I needed capital, and hence the coal mines were part and parcel of that. Still wasn't earning enough, so I went shearing.
Just sticking with the coal mines for a second, you said an interesting thing. Is that working down a mine teaches you a lot about yourself and the people you work with. Why is that? Because it's such a dangerous, confined environment?
I suppose it was teamwork and the camaraderie, and it was like coming from 2 little towns. Nightcaps and Ojai, on the rugby field, mortal enemies. The religion in the towns, there was Catholic, Presbyterian and Anglican. During the day, it was fairly obvious. But down the mine, the moment you went underground, it was all forgotten.
Right.
And it was the camaraderie, the mateship, how they worked together.
You had to rely on each other.
Absolutely relied on each other. And you were part of a team. And I enjoyed that. It was like, for the guys that were digging coal, I went down there as a trucker, and it was just a matter of keeping the boxes that they were filling with coal up to the miners. I thought, this is relatively easy. I think that lasted for about half a day, and I was given a shovel. If you were down there, you shoveled with us. And so you become part of a team. And then you got the respect from those guys because you were part of it. But there was no room for slacking. You know, you very quickly got sorted out.
Did you see many incidents and accidents?
Not really for the time that I spent, but, you know, our neighbour was killed down the mines, Lou Boxer, and there wasn't that many accidents when I think about it, but when there was an accident, it was usually a good one, and there was, people were badly hurt or killed. I can remember 2 guys. I finished up working on the pillars with a couple of really hard cases. Des Taraki was one, and Tombstone Hunter. Toomey was well named. He looked like he'd come out of a coffin. But I can remember working in a pillar, and it was close to closing. Bride MacIntyre was our deputy, and he come through this particular day, and he's tapping the roof, and he says, "That's it, boys, you're finished. We're closing down. You've taken as much out as you can." Toomey looked at it and he said, "I can get another box." We're sitting back inside the solid watching it, and next minute out he goes, and he goes like hell, fills the box, comes back in. No sooner sat down than the next minute there was a boof. About 5 ton of coal fell off the roof. Where he was standing, he'd have been dead.
Wow.
Just like that. But what did he do? He laughed and he says, "I told you I could get another one." So that was sort of the attitude,
Yeah.
So you, to a degree, I suppose you were taught how to analyse a risk. Guys would take risks. They worked hard. But for me, we'd go underground 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'd be back out by 2:30 on the day shift. So that left me too much to do at night, and I thought, I'm wasting time. So I jumped the fence one day, met up with a neighbour who was a shearer. I said, "Could you give me a go?" And that was the end of the mines.
So then you went full-time shearing?
Full-time shearing at 16. And I think it was in November we started, and I managed to do my first 200 between the Christmas and New Year. Never had so much money in my life.
So,
and that was it.
I don't know much about shearing, but what's a typical tally for a gun shearer?
Then it was 200 a day.
Yep.
Little old handpiece with an OLT comb. And if you could break 200, you were considered a good shearer. And that was a very good living. But I suppose on average it would take you a season or 2 seasons to get near it. And I managed to achieve that probably in the first 2.5 months.
Wow.
And
so you're in the big bucks now.
Yeah, and I suppose it changed the group of people I was working with, because all of a sudden I can remember the guys that I grew up with and went to school with. I seemed to have left them behind because you were working with men. And it was like you were a shearer. You were 16, come 17. You weren't allowed into a pub until you were 21. All your guys that you were working with would go to the pub on the way home. 5:30 knock off, 5:45 you'd be in the pub, or whenever. You'd throw down 3 jugs. It was like refueling. And of course I'm in there as a kid.
Because your mates are still at school.
They're still at school. Yeah. Some of them are still at school. And some of them are still trying to find their way. So it stepped me into, I suppose, a group of people that were in their 20s and 25s and up through 30s.
And shearing seems to be one of those industries that really gets ingrained in who you are, doesn't it? Forever.
It is. It's a game whereby you can't. If you're going to cheat, you're cheating on yourself. You only ever get paid for what you do. So you can speak all the bullshit you like, but it's always proven when you step onto that board. And hence I had a couple of really good guys that taught me a lot.
I think you said something, I've got a note. It was a great learning curve, that's shearing. It taught me how to sift bullshit from fact at an early age.
And that is a fact, because that's one game you could not bullshit in. You know?
And something else you said, quite a nice paragraph. I enjoyed the time I spent shearing. It was hard work. You were only ever paid for what you did. I have a great deal of respect for those who pick up a shearer's handpiece and have a go. All those that I met were hard-working, honest men of good character who never complained or were known to hide behind an excuse. It's a pity that some of the people I've met since didn't have the backbone and strength of character that describes a good shearer.
And I live by that today.
Right.
Yeah. It's ingrained.
Yeah.
You really found out who people were. Really intelligent guys, hardworking, and you could get an absolute measure on them based on their output.
How many years did you shear for?
I shore until I was about 20.
Yeah.
I can remember coming home for Christmas from the Auckland Flying School, and I had to go back and sit a couple of the subjects. I was out of money, so the only thing I could do was pick up a handpiece. but I wasn't fit. I was as soft as anything after spending about 3 or 4 months in Auckland, and thought I could do exactly what I'd left. I couldn't. I got into it real hard, and within about 4 days I slipped a disc in my back, and then I knew that I had to be back in Auckland in February. So I had about 5 to 6 weeks to get sufficient back in my kit to ensure that I could survive for that time.
Wow.
So I finished up sleeping on boards, try and get my back in. I'd get that and then go for it the next day. And that was probably about the hardest time. But then I realized how fit you had to be if you were working hard, but also that fitness built inside a degree of toughness, I suppose. With
mental toughness. And it certainly makes you respect older guys doing that, into their 30s and 40s.
I often, I've looked at marathon runners and seen them doing their bits and pieces and seeing competition. To me, shearing 8 hours a day, sweating from start to finish, was like a marathon, and it was a race. And I first realized that when I, gained a stand on Mount Linton. And there was the old ringer, a fellow called Archie Walker. I can still remember him coming down the board. I was number 12 on the stand, probably 17 years old. And he tapped me in the shoulder and he says, "You come up with me, boy." And he took me up to number 2 and he said, "I'll teach you how to shear." So he taught me how to work the clock, got timing right and to balance up.
So this is more of as much a mental game as a physical
Mental
game.
And physical. Balance and timing, knowing your body, understanding that you're going to go for 8 hours. Don't burn yourself out in the first 2, because you've got to be going as good at the end of 8 hours as you were for the first hour. And so hence, work the clock, understand it. And I was a bit lucky, I suppose. He worked out that I could shear a sheep in about 48 seconds to a minute. And so he took me up there, showed me how to work the clock, when to start, look after my gear. And then he gave me the catch. His timing was so perfect. He'd run me right into the gong at smoko, lunch, afternoon tea. And we always stopped on the hour to roll a cigarette. And he'd give me that catch. So nobody would start before the ringer. So I'd just finish in front of him, he'd stop, and I'd go and get another one. So he gave me 4 to 8 sheep a day. And so that was probably the proudest moment of my life. I'm 18 years old, and Mount Linton was sort of, if you had a stand there, that meant something. And to ring it at 18 years old meant a hell of a lot more. But it wasn't me, it was him. He taught me.
But you listened.
I had to listen.
Yeah.
Because he had faith in me, and I thought, well, I've got to try.
In 1968, you got married, and there was quite an amusing story about. You mentioned the religious division in the town. There was quite an amusing story about your wedding dramas.
Well, the town was divided then, and religion was a big thing. It was well respected. Church was full every Sunday in the Catholic Church, but the Anglicans had theirs and the Presbyterians. And I can always remember the Presbyterian church going on fire as a kid. You could feel the division between the religions, but when that church went on fire, everybody in the town was there to try and put it out. And I can still remember seeing my father on the roof with buckets of water pouring it down the steeple, trying to put it out, and wondering, why the hell would they be trying to put the Presbyterian church out when there's such a division? And hence, that was a spark, I suppose, that went off inside my head and always stuck there. And of course, I fell in love with a very good-looking girl in the town called Jane Hamilton. She was Presbyterian.
And you were Catholic.
And I was Catholic. She was a good Presbyterian, Sunday school and everything like that. How the hell she ever tangled up with me, I don't know.
Because you were a bad Catholic, were you?
I don't think I was going to be canonized a saint. And long story short, she was prepared to convert to Catholicism, but the first meeting we had with the local priest, he started to pick on her a bit. He was indoctrinating. And I took exception to that. As we walked out, I said to her, "You better make an appointment for me with your minister." I can still remember her saying, "Would you really come and talk to him?" I said, "Yes." So I took the priest's argument to the minister, and then the minister's argument back to the priest. So I kept it going
without them each knowing.
Without them knowing. What a bloody battle.
I can see where this is going.
Yeah, so my wife to be just sat there and listened while I battled with the two religious men. And of course, then the town took it on. So there became a division. They started to argue about the religions in the hotel, and it even got to the mines. But it stopped when they went down underground. Mm-hmm. But they'd fight in the pubs over it. And I can remember my mother saying for me, "For God's sake, you have caused so much trouble around here. Will you just go to Invercargill, get married and get the hell out of the place?" I says, "No, I was born here. I was raised here. I'll get married here." And then it was a great wedding. But it was still divided.
But didn't some people not turn up because?
Oh yes, on my side of the family, especially Mum's side. I can remember they couldn't go. The local priest was over the pulpit, pointing the finger. This is a mixed marriage. You're not allowed to go. And I can remember my father walked out of the church. We went home, and I can still remember sitting on the couch at home, and Mum saying, "I can't go to the wedding. I'm a Catholic. I just can't go." And he just looked at her, and he says, "Pat," my mother's name was Patricia, "you'll be sitting in the front seat of that church with me. That's the end of it." And there was no more argument. Yes, and they were fairly staunch, and so hence a lot of respect for my father. All as I know, when he spoke, you listened. You could con Mum, but you could never con him.
I'm going to read a few paragraphs out of your book, because as I read them, they really sort of rung true, a lot of them. So there's one here about lessons on risk from your upbringing in Nightcaps. To me, Nightcaps was the centre of the universe, where you were free to run wild and take all sorts of risks, provided nobody got severely hurt and you made it home each night, albeit scratched and grazed in time for bed. At a very early age, we learnt how to define risk. I'm sure this has helped with our decision-making as adults. I do feel for the young and overprotected youth of today, especially those brought up in an urban environment that are not allowed to or don't know how to enjoy the excitement and adventures we had as children. We were let loose at an early age that saw us take charge and be responsible for our own lives by the age of 16. One way or another we were contributing. Thank God we are not subject to the political correctness that is demanded of the general population today. And it's just so true.
Yeah, well, today I still look back, and I think that it's I look back at the teenagers and young people coming through and feel sorry for them, to the point whereby we were allowed to take the risk. We weren't overprotected. Sometimes I look at health and safety and think, what the hell have you done to us? You've taken away the ability to analyse risk. You've taken away the ability to be responsible for yourself. And in doing so, you've taken away the fact that if you make a mistake, you get hurt and you'll feel the pain of the mistake. So by not having that choice and not feeling that, you lose the ability to analyse it.
We're certainly a product of what we've created, aren't we?
Definitely are. I look at the schooling, and I sit there and I look at young men that are coming still at school at 17, don't want to be there. A percentage of them have matured, they should have moved on. And then you think, where to from here? How much more learning? How much time have they wasted? And I suppose I'm a fair believer in the fact that everybody's born with a degree of intelligence. There is, rightly or wrongly, there's a massive emphasis on education, to the point whereby, you've got to go to university, this, that, and the next thing. Well, to me, university was a place for probably the top 5 or 10% of people, not courses for everybody. And so life's an education. And my attitude towards that was, I'll learn it as I need to. And I suppose aviation taught me that. I can remember, doing my commercial pilot's license and thinking that was it. I should have stayed longer and done a senior commercial in my instrument rating. A number of years later, I realized I needed an instrument rating. So I went to a course over at Motueka. Sat down there and sucked it up like blotting paper because I was ready to learn. Absolutely enjoyed it. Now, you could hold me at school for 12 months and probably try and teach me the same things. I wouldn't have absorbed it as quickly then as I did, when I tried later.
It's crazy the number of people you see just like that. Can't learn a thing at school, get called dyslexic or whatever, and then get them into a field 5 or 10 years later and they, like you say, suck it up.
Yeah, well, it's. I suppose when I look back, I look at the division between male and female, and then you realise that girls mature faster. Biologically, their clocks get set 11 or 12, and they're away. You see it with regards to the arguments I'll be having with their parents as teenagers. I brought up 2 daughters, best education of my life, but young males are slower. And from what I see. So a lot of them aren't really ready to get going, and some of them are 25 before they really hit their mark. But you watch them coming through. You'll see the best coming out of young males at the age of around about 40. What they contribute between 40 and 55 is massive.
Yeah, that's
because
very true.
It's like they're sitting there saying, I've learnt enough, now I'm going to put it into practice. Where the girls are out of the box much faster. They're mothers, and they're doing what they need to do with their children and so on. And so, to me, you can't defy nature. You've got to run with it. And anybody that keeps trying to manipulate it just seems to constantly make a mistake. They get caught by it.
So you paid for your flying lessons by Shearing. And after you got your PPL, I think you got a visit from Bill Hewitt offering you a job as a trainee. Was that right? As a trainee ag pilot?
Yeah, I was heading off to do my commercial, and it was a local publican, Vic Gherkin, down at Raised Bush. I was sharing at a shed next door to the hotel. Of course, he used to drink there.
And talking about that, even now he has a reputation. Bill Hewitt.
Yes. Well, I can remember him walking into the shearing shed with Vic. Vic introduced him and he says, "Oh, you want to become a pilot?" Yeah, I said, "I'm going to be an ag pilot." So he talked to us for about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour. And he says, "Well, you got a job." And I had a run by then. I had about 4 or 5 guys working with me and a lot of support from local farmers. So I just threw that away, give it to my mates, and says, "Right, I'm off." And in February started with Bill Hewitt, put into an old GMC loader. Christ, I couldn't even drive a truck. He was a pilot, he wasn't a driver, and off we went from there. Do you want to hear about the first day?
Absolutely.
Well, I can remember arriving in Mossburn Sunday night into a little hut. Hell, this was a massive change for me. Monday morning, 7 o'clock, down in front of the hangar. Out goes the 185, cranked that up. Where are we going? Mount Linton. I thought, "Oh, hell, I'm going back home." First stop was Raised Bush Hotel. Hadn't had breakfast. And I don't know, I must be calling in here for a bit of breakfast with old Vic before we go to work. We landed behind the hotel, through the back fence. Old Vic opens up the door, straight through the kitchen into the bar. We had a jug.
This is, 8 or 9 in the morning.
Yeah, about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. And then carried out half a dozen of beer each. Bill had some whiskey and some gin and so on, and a couple of flagons, into the aircraft and off to Mount Linton.
Wow. Were you surprised by that, or did you sort of...
Well, no.
No.
I thought, suck it up. Let's see what What's going on here? Shit, is this egg flying? And hence cranked up the old GMC loader. He showed me how to change the gears. Farted around for a bit, managed to get a load on it. He said, "Oh, you'll work it out." He said, "Don't hit the aircraft." Give me some fairly severe instructions. Got a load into the back of him. Within half an hour, it had it sorted. Away he went. It was sort of mid-February, and one of those hot days in Southland, bit of nor'west blowing. And he said, "When you see me go like this, I'm looking for gas." A couple of hours later, plane pulls over to the side. I get the way, pull the old loader in front of him, and I thought, "Oh, he'll get out, give me a hand." No, stayed there. Filled him up with gas, backed off, put another load in, and away he went. Another 2 hours. Lunchtime. And I thought, shit, I'm hungry. And I'm dry. When's he going to stop? Pulls in. More gas. No lunch. No morning tea. Away he goes again. Done it again. 4 o'clock next when he pulls into the side, pulls up to the side of the strip, and I can still see it today. The door flew open and he fell out.
Wow.
Onto the ground. Then pulled himself up and he's hanging onto the strut. "I've had enough today. We're going home." I'm dry, I'm hungry, and I thought, hell, if this is egg flying, I'll eat my hat.
And this was his typical day. Do you think he got on the booze every morning?
Oh, I don't know. He would have topped up. He would have had to gas up some part of it, I think. But I remember getting into the aircraft, sitting down beside him, and he's got a half-gallon jar stuck between his legs, so he took off and headed back from Osborne, and I thought, shit, if you don't give me, don't offer that half-gallon up, I'm just going to take it in a minute. And my nature started to come out. Then he looked at me and he says, "Oh, you're dry." I said, "Yes." And I reached over and he said, "Here, take this." Well, I was a good beer drinker by that time, being a shearer. I thought what was left in that half-gallon jar was going straight into my stomach, and I went up, bang, boof. It comes straight back up, and I spat it over the windscreen.
Nasty.
It was hot, it was flat, and he tipped the whiskey and the gin into it.
Well, they were different days, weren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just hard even to imagine now.
Yeah. But if I have a look around the cruise, then like it was, and Christopher was my groomsman when I got married, and Chris was, I think everybody ran on alcohol to a degree. Ronnie Bush was the same.
I think, was it Ron Bush that kept alcohol under a seat and he called it his cocktail cabinet? Was that right?
Yeah, I reckon you could stick your hand in under Bush's seat, and it was like putting your hand into a cocktail cabinet. It's totally different. Again, there was adventure. That it was new, and to me, it was exciting. And they were brilliant pilots, absolutely brilliant pilots.
I wonder if they needed to be a bit intoxicated to keep the skill level up.
Well, they were both ex-World War II guys, and I understand that Ron was sort of Bill's commanding officer. They were trained in Canada, I think, and when they came back, there was nothing else to do. So when you had a look at the heart and the soul of those guys, they were determined they were pilots. They were always going to be involved in aviation. And so they had to figure out a way of making a living. So hence, that was the start of aerial top dressing.
You had a story about Ron Bush who didn't like banter against him. And I think you said one day in a 180, he picked up a whole lot of gravel.
Well, Bushy was like some people. He could hand it out. He was very good at great sarcastic conversations and could take the piss. But he didn't really like it being thrown back at him. He couldn't suck it up like he could give it. And we were sitting, blown out by a nor'wester, sitting in the front of the hangar in Mossburn. And there was Chris and I think Bill, if I remember rightly, a couple of the loader drivers. Bushy's loader driver. And anyway, the banter got to the point whereby they started to pick on Bushy, and he really took the hump. And next minute he grabs his driver and takes off. That's it, we're out of here. Didn't even warm up, took into the plane, started off and away. And instead of heading towards Gore, he headed north. I can remember Bill saying, where the hell he's going? So we sat there, half-gallon jars, having a beer, totally relaxed. And it was about 11 o'clock. Next minute, we see coming past Mid-Dome, the 180. And then it turns in towards the hangar, getting lower and lower. Hell, he come across the airstrip as low as a spray pilot, pulled up in front of the hangar, then let it go. He'd been away and filled half the hopper up with stones and landed on a riverbed, and he bombed us.
Wow.
What a bloody mess. But Bill had the common sense to think, hang on, this is not a safe place to be. And he just got up out of his chair and he says, I think we should move. And he just walked into the office, and we all just followed him. We were sitting in the office and hearing the clattering and the banging going on as that the river rocks flew into the front of the hangar. Done a hell of a lot of damage.
Jeep.
Never seen him for about 3 or 4 weeks. Wouldn't come back. I can remember Bill going right off his face. What a bloody mess.
Yeah.
But if we'd have sat there, I reckon somebody got bloody killed.
Mm.
Yeah,
And one day you said there was 3 accidents in the company.
Yeah, well, Dave Carthy, I was loading for 2 of the, for both him and Ron. And we were down at Opio. And I can't remember the third guy. I can see his face. I can't remember his name. But anyway, it was a downhill strip, and at the end of the strip there was pine trees. And we were sowing what we called a 3-in-1 super. It was very fluffy. And, it was quite sticky. And so Dave took off with a full load on, and then next minute he went to jettison, load half hung up, and he flipped across the top of the pine trees, come back in and landed, and there's bloody green stain all over his wings, underneath the wings. Lucky he didn't knock his tailplane off. It was stained and there was a few dents. He was a bit white face, looked at it and thought, hell, I'm out of here. So he took off and flew to Gore. And anyway, there was only Bushy and myself left. So I think Bush had been into the cocktail cabinet a bit. Anyway, I put a load into him, and next minute it's spewing down the back of the fuselage from the hopper. He's overloaded to hell. So I jumped out of the loader, raced over, banged on the door, told him, you're overloaded, it's running off your back. You've come back in with part load on. And he just looked at me. And he said, you load it, I fly it, and slammed the door. And took off down the strip. Well, the farmer's name was Alan Nicholson. He was a little short guy, really good guy. And as he went down the strip, you thought, shit, he's in trouble. Next minute, you're seeing the super start to dribble out the bottom. He went to jettison, missed, his load had hung up. He hit the pine trees about 2/3 of the way up. Lucky he went down the row, and there was just, whoa. Well, we took off, Alan and his old Land Rover, and I think it was the funniest thing I've ever seen. If you've seen those comedies, the Donald Duck come Goofy comedies, where Goofy's had a bit of a batter, and you can see the satellites and the sparks running around his head. And anyway, out of the scrub, out of the pine trees come Bushy, staggering like he'd been knocked about.
Still flying?
No, he was walking.
Oh, walking.
He knocked the wings off the 180.
Oh, right.
He went down. It was the simple fact that he went down a row, the wings took the impact and just pancaked straight in. So 180 the 185 looked like a lightning fighter. He swept back. He's never wore a helmet or anything like that, and he's got blood and he's running down his face, he's cut on the head, and he's staggering around, didn't know where he was. I can still see Alan racing up to him. Are you all right? Are you all right? And Bushy looked at him, and there was a mouthful of expletives coming out about who was the dopey bastard that ever thought of growing pine trees at the end of an airstrip. It was not his fault. He blamed the cocky and stripped him right down. Well, I don't think I've laughed so much in all my life. And then one of the other guys, as the fellow I couldn't remember, he hit a sheep on Burwood. So that was 3 180s, or 2 180s and a 185 that were damaged in the 3 days. It was a Sunday. Probably shouldn't have been flying, the Lord's Day.
Not a great day. Yeah. So you didn't have a CPL at this point, did you?
No.
You went off to do a
I
CPL.
went off there that winter, went off on the CPL, and when I come back, ready to go, Hewitt Aviation had sold out to rural. The game had changed, and there was a bit of a downturn. It was like timing was bad. So I can remember there was 15 of us on our course in Auckland. We didn't all get through. And
how did you go with the course and the exams? Because you'd left school early, and I mean, this is all a bit new to you, I suppose.
Massive struggle in the first instance. I can remember getting up there in the first progress test, getting 40%, knowing that we needed 60 or 70% as a pass rate, all essay written, and you had to be reasonable in English. And I can remember a lecturer from Auckland University coming to talk to us on the first morning, and he just looked at us and said, if you smoke, you're going to miss it. How many smokers? Half us put our hands up. I'm telling you now, throw the smokes away. The amount of work you're going to have to do to get through and the time allocated is such that you won't have time to smoke. So I threw the cigarettes away, and away we went. First progress test, 40%. Shit. Second progress, 60%. Third progress, I was in the 90s. I thought I got a chance. Went through, I can always remember the old fellow from Auckland University saying, these papers are designed to keep you going for the full time. So if you finish early, you can consider you've failed. You shouldn't be able to complete. I sailed through, finished early and everything like that. Missed 2 subjects. He was right, I was wrong. Mm-hmm. So I had to come back. So we got 2 cracks at the exams, and that was to hold a commercial pilot's license on 150 hours. So I sailed through, then come back, and then stayed there.
And you said when you got home, your dad was out of it for 3 days.
Yep.
That was after your CPL.
Yeah, well, I was broke.
Yeah.
And I can remember ringing my mother, because I didn't want to talk to my father. And I says, Mum, got my CPL and I'm through. So I'm on my way home, but I'm broke. Can you put some cash in my bank for me? She said, ask your father. I said, no way in hell. I said, I know his attitude. Ask your father. There's no way I'll be putting cash in your bank. So anyway, he gets on the phone. It was a very short conversation. Broke. How much do you need? I said, about 60 quid. I said, and I'll fly home Friday. This was a Monday. And it was just, it'll be in your bank in the morning. Bang, hung up. That's not such a good reception. So I think I needed about 20 quid for the airfare, and I had about 40 left. So 3 or 4 of us and our mates, we partied for the next 3 or 4 days. I still arrived home broke nothing. That's when my mother picked me up, and she wasn't a happy chappy, I tell you. And here was the old man. He'd been celebrating since he'd found out that I got into it.
Good on him.
But the big thing that I found out, and this was only of late, and it was my sister that told me, because I was telling her the story, and she said, you've got it all wrong. I said, what do you mean I've got it all wrong? She said, it was never Dad. She said, it was Mum. I said, what do you mean? She said, I heard the arguments when she was younger. Mum was terrified of you becoming a pilot, and she would give Dad hell.
Was she thinking you're going to get killed? Or?
Yeah, she was just terrified of it. And he wasn't so bad. But he backed her. And right to this day, he'd never sort of come back out and says, no, it was your mum.
Wow.
It was just my sister. Mm. And so I blamed him for a lot that he was probably not responsible for. But all he was doing was transmitting mum's fear.
Yeah. But deep down, he was probably, he could see that he's stuck in the mines all his life and you're going to be out of that. And he was probably very proud of you.
Well, it was from there on. It wasn't until, I was in my 20s that I really got to know him. Because you were growing up and you were learning, and hence they were his disciplines that he was instilling.
Yeah. So you're 19 at this point, 20?
19, 20.
So you've actually done a lot by this time. You've done coal mining and shearing and farming, and you had also had a bit to do with horse racing too. Were you a jockey or training them? Or?
No, well, looking at me now, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a jockey. I loved riding, loved horses and stuff like that. And as I once said to somebody that, people that like horses really like horses. And I said, well, I was one of those unfortunates. I was born with a little bit of horse shit up one nostril, and I haven't managed to get it out. So, I've always been fond of horses, thoroughbreds.
Yeah.
I love the sport.
So you've done a hell of a lot, and a CPL, and about to be an egg pilot, all by 19, and all your mates are probably just leaving school a year or two before.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, when you got back from your CPL course, you then went to work for Phoenix. Was that right?
Yes, Phoenix.
Yep.
It went Hewitt, rural, then that's crashed, and Peter Brown and a group of farmers decided to put Phoenix Aviation together, and so there was 4 or 5 of us kicked in there. There was Peter Brown, Brian Dovey, Peter Lloyd, Ivor Hagan, and I was the new boy in the block. And so I was under Ivor for about a month or something.
Flying an ag wagon.
Flying an ag wagon. So for me, that was a brand new ag wagon, and hell, that age.
Did you enjoy it as much as you thought you would?
I loved it. Loved every minute of it. And I, as I said, even today, I know when I go onto YouTube or whatever, I find myself clicking onto the ag, the ag pilots and watching them flying and thinking I should have spent more time at it, because I've never really got it out of my system. I should have stayed there for another couple of years. That's the only regret I've got.
I think you said you had 3 engine failures in a week or 10 days at one point.
Yeah, it's first one was a partial failure at Tiana. So I had John Dunn finished up. John got killed. He was I was his sort of chief pilot or trainer. Borrowed his aircraft, went down to Gore, picked up the engineer, got it sorted. We burnt out a fuel pump. We couldn't figure out why. And that was sorted, and it was about a fortnight later, or 10 days, I'm down at Riverton, and next minute, bang, coming back in, and she's spluttering and coughing. And anyway, I just flipped around. I thought, shit, it's a fuel pump or something's gone again. So I got back to Gore just on the auxiliary pump. Kept it going. I just climbed, and I thought, well, if I can make Gore, I will. I'll land it in a paddock somewhere if I can't. And hence, engine in an ag wagon sits in a cradle, and it hinges on on the bottom. It's plugged into the top of the fuselage. It's hinged at the bottom so you can fold it forward. Boys took it out. Bang, it was another fuel pump. Just burnt out. And we couldn't figure out what it was because we were shammying all the fuel in. So they said, but we just can't figure out why you're burning them out. So they got that fixed. I was in a bit of a hurry. Put the cowlings and everything back on. And I pulled out in the middle of the afternoon. And I'm sitting in front of the hangar. And by that time, I'm starting to get a bit edgy because this is 3. And so I run it up. And I'm sitting there just checking the mags. And the rev counter just went, the needle just went, but I never picked anything up on the air, but it just gave a flick. I looked at it and thought, why? Sat there for a minute, run it up again, and I've done exactly the same thing. So I run it up 3 times. Imagining things. And I can always remember old Lou Day when we were doing our, part of our flying. Trust your instruments. Trust your instruments. Don't try and second guess them. And he instilled that into us. So I taxied part way out and I thought, bugger this. So I run it up again and I took it up to full power and I just sat on the brakes. And I'm watching. Next minute the RPM gauge, the needle went. And next minute there was a bang. And the gauges started disappearing out of the panel. The engine had jumped out the front, still hinged on the bottom, turned it into probably the biggest rotor cut lawnmower that had ever been seen in Gore. Chopped the tyres off the front wheels.
Wow.
And there it was sitting there. But when I worked it out, if I hadn't run it up, I'd have probably been 1,000 foot in the air.
Mm.
And she'd have let go.
Mm.
So they hadn't torqued up the bolts into the top of the cradle, holding the engine. And
scary.
So, it wasn't scary. It was the fact that, believed the instruments.
Scary to think of what could have happened.
Mm. But then you just went straight back to work.
Yeah. So you flew ag for a few years?
Yeah, about 2 years.
And then...
2 and a bit.
Yeah.
And
then ended up working for Tim Wallace.
Yes, for Alpine.
Yeah.
Or Luggett Game Packers it was then. There was Bill Black was in TR now. I was sort of round Queenstown. I'd started, my boundary was basically Milford Sound or here to Lake TR now, the Clintons, and that was up to as far as Mount Cook.
How did you end up in changing from fixed wing to helicopters?
Well, I was in national training. The only ballot I ever won in my life was I pulled the marble for national service. So I had to go in the army. So we're encamped down at Tyree, and they announced over the loudspeaker system that there was a couple of guys wanting to see me. And it was Don Sparry and Tim Wallace to see if I'd come join them in helicopters. And at that time I was young, married, and I hadn't really given it a thought because really I'm a fixed wing pilot. I've always liked fixed wings. Never really, loved flying helicopters, but I didn't have the passion for them that I had for fixed wings. So I thought about it, rang my wife, and said, I've had this offer, we better talk about it. So I asked them if they said I couldn't come straight away because I was halfway through a season with, the autumn season with Phoenix. So I said the earliest I could possibly get there would have been the end of April, May, because I was going to finish that season. They'd been so good to me. Mm. And went home, talked about it, talked to Pete Brown, and Pete says, if you want to go, no problems. He turned out to be one of my best mates, So I said, well, I don't think it'll last long anyway. It's hunting deer and what have you.
Famous last words.
Yeah. And so finished up in Arrowtown. Don Sparry was my instructor. He was a brilliant instructor. He was really, really good. And so I put down to him everything that I'd learned with regards to how to take care of myself and the helicopter and my crew. And I suppose it was about the end of July, August sometime. I can remember letting down and completed my rating. I think we'd only done about 8 to 10 hours or 20 hours, I think, in total, and probably less. And then we were letting down into Fox Glacier with the crew, and I thought to myself, shit, if I'm still here in 6 months, I'll eat my bloody hat. I didn't go through what I've gone to finish up working on the coast chasing deer.
In 13 years, I think.
13 years later, I'm still there. Had a ball.
To those of us like me that have done a bit of hunting, you're into flying. I mean, I look back now at that industry and it just seems like a dream to be part of. And I wrote down a few words that come to my mind looking back on those venison days. Wild west of New Zealand, a modern day gold rush, the camaraderie that you made. It was almost like a war situation, with relying on your mates. The risk. It was a new frontier with few rules, the last great adventure, and it's all just opposite to the cotton wool, nanny state that we have today. So you look back on it and you think, wow, I would love to be part of that. Is it, when you look back on it, are all those things, what you see now, or was it like that at the time?
When you say it like that, it reminds me of Nightcaps, to the point where what I enjoyed more about it than anything else was the absolute freedom. The fact that you had to, the gear we were flying, old Hillers and Bells, coming out of Korea, they weren't designed for what we were doing, and they were underpowered, so you were working at max. I can remember sitting down there and looking at the helicopter and thinking, right, same engine that we had in the top dressers, a good 300 horsepower, max RPM, when your top dressing was about 3,000, you had about 5 minutes and you had to pull back to 24 inches, 2,400 RPM or whatever, 23. And here's the same old engine running it constantly at 31 and a half, 31 and a half. And you were pulling max power to, cruising around at 22 inches. And I thought, shit, this has actually got them maxed out, they're working it to full strength. And here we were sitting up, especially around Mount Cook with an old Hiller, right on your limits, virtually outside your envelope. The outer ground effect hovering ability was not for those altitudes with that sort of gear. So, you say the adventure, the freedom, you're actually designing what you were doing as you went. And you were teaching yourself and you were learning by some of the mistakes and so on. And there was quite a few made, but...
And I mean, looking back, there's a lot of accidents and a lot of deaths, but we're not part of it. I'm not part of the fear that you probably had and the nervous tension every day going to work because of all these things you're just saying. So it's probably very different looking back now at what I see as an amazing thing to be part of, and then you're actually in it day to day.
Well, I think what you did do, you learned to trust your gear, you learned to trust yourself, and you had to make sure that you're absolutely maintained. I had if I was flying the machine, I didn't want anybody else to fly it, because every time somebody else got in your machine, I reckon you could feel it the next time you got in it. You had to be so sensitive to how it was performing. So you trusted your gear, and then, how can I put it? As long as it was not an equipment failure, with regards to some of the accidents, and you could see pilot error, then it was, were you going to make that same mistake? No, you weren't. And so your age said that you're sort of semi-bulletproof.
Yeah.
And off you went, because you're not going to make the mistake of somebody else.
No, of course not. I've got a lot to ask you about this time, because it's, all really interesting. But I just thought, for anyone watching this that's not familiar with the history of the venison recovery period, I might just run through a few sort of stats and figures that I've written down, because it's a crazy time. And there's a really good podcast on Radio New Zealand called Deer Wars, which I'm sure you've seen, but I'd recommend people to listen to it if you haven't. So deer were introduced in New Zealand in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they were released into a country and environment where there's plenty of food, there's no predators, and in only 10 or 20 years they spread, and I think by 1910 they were out of control. So no time at all. And the government started paid deer culling only in 1930 to try and control it. In 1957, I read that government cullers shot 62,000 deer, weren't even making a dent in it. In 1973, at the peak of the helicopter period, they shot or captured 140,000 deer. 1960s meat was worth 9 cents a pound. By 1973, it was worth $1 a pound. 1968, a well-known ground shooter, Mike Bennett, said he had shot 10,000 deer himself, which wasn't an uncommon number. 1973, there was up to 100 helicopters working on deer, average daily tallies of 100 a day, some up to 200, could be pulling $15,000 or $17,000 a day in those days' numbers. 1973, 2 Air Force Iroquois helicopters were sent to Fiordland to try and stop the poaching issues, which they never could. Typical to have a regular weekly booking on the helicopter for a 50-hour check, and I think Bill Black had a 50-hour check every 3.5 days, he said, so this shows the amount of hours they were doing. Tim Wallace had his ship Ranganui, based in Fiordland, set up as a floating freezer that would get filled in 3 days. The value of captured deer rose from $250 in 76 to up to $5,000 per animal in 79. Between 76 and 1982, 208 helicopters crashed while hunting, which is an average of 35 a year. At the time, New Zealand had by far the worst record of helicopter accidents in the world. At one point, of the last 20 helicopters imported into New Zealand, 16 were completely written off. Alpine Helicopters lost 9 helicopters in 1 year, and the average life expectancy of a deer jumper was only 2 years. So, I mean, these are just crazy numbers and a crazy time, and the whole thing was just a perfect storm which all came together, you know, the huge deer numbers, the price of venison, the helicopters were on the scene. It's never going to be repeated, is it? But it must have been wild to be part of.
Well, you say never to be repeated. That side of it's never going to be repeated, but the deer numbers are going to expand. They are expanding at the moment.
Yeah.
And so the same problem exists today, in my mind, as existed in the 60s and 70s. And there was no way in hell that, you know, you could say forestry or colours had the ability to anywhere near manage, you know, the numbers, you know, as the only predator.
Do you think we can manage it today, though, with all our rules and requirements and resource management acts?
Well, what we demonstrated, and you know, I'm reverting back to why, you know, we were talking about adventures and sunrise industries. That was a sunrise industry where the attitude, I think, then was the fact that you could actually look at a resource, find a market for it, develop it, and it was good for the country. It became an industry. If you look at it today with all the regulations and everything like that, I don't know how you turn it back into an industry, albeit you've got machinery available is a lot better and far more sophisticated than what we had during those periods. So I dare say that we'll come up with a solution, but it won't be the same as that one. You know, I can remember going up the Haast Valley, just up the Haast River one morning, and I think by 11 o'clock we'd shot and recovered 96 deer. That was for a morning shoot. So those numbers slowly disappeared, but I can remember when we started, you could walk into the bush, you know, in Haast, and especially up the head of the hunter and so on, and it was like walking onto a carpet. There was no regeneration. They absolutely had the country stuffed, and given time without control or without that industry, we wouldn't have been looking at Fiordland National Park as it is today.
No. And something I thought of when I was, you know, looking at all of this is there's a lot of talk about the wild times and the accidents and all that, but you don't hear a lot about what was achieved for the forests. You know, like you say, if you guys hadn't done what you'd done, albeit at great cost, we wouldn't have what we have today in terms of our national parks and forests, would we?
No, I can remember going into a couple of head basins and up the Hunter when I first started and thinking, oh shit, there's been a fire. I thought, no, beech doesn't burn like that, because it was dead. And then when we got down and had a look at it, part of it, the trees had been ring barked, they'd been stripped. There was no regeneration. You could see for miles. So you could see it was like a cancer. You could see that slowly creeping into the rest of it with regards to the numbers. Mm. Then you went to the bottom end of Fiordland, where the deer were small. The numbers were massive, and they were just eating the place out. That was the beginning of the 70s.
Yeah.
So what we did then, or what was done then, it was like a sport. It was competitive. It brought out all the basic vices of greed and jealousy and envy. It threw a degree of imbalance, I suppose, into how people looked at it. It was like a gold rush. Mm. I think we'd worked it out at one stage. It cost around about $150 an hour to run a hiller. And I know with the tallies that we were producing, we were earning better than $1,000, $1,100, $1,200 an hour. So the cash that flew was the incentive for others to get involved. And then you've seen that sort of, in my mind, you've seen it transmit through the industry, through the population and through government with regards to how it was being managed. So they went from a pest to an asset. So those that were involved with solving a problem, and they created an international market which basically paid for the protection of the forests as we understand it today. Mm. Because we couldn't do it from what you would call a tax take, not in my mind. So having said that, and introducing some of the vices of greed, jealousy, and everything else, actually explains some of the attitudes. And, it's like, I can remember going into one run holder who deer were giving him a massive problem with regards to eating out the feed and cattle. We went in and for the morning shot, we were just in there a couple of hours, 3 hours, and I think we'd come out with about 36 deer. He'd figured out how much they were. The next minute he cancelled. So, no, I don't want you to shoot anymore. They're mine. They're our deer. And I says, no, not. They're the Crown's deer. Deer belong to those who shoot them. Show me title. When did you purchase them? They were a problem. You've now smelt the money attached to them. Mm. And so you're trying to utilize the law to say they're mine. They're not yours. They still belong to the general population. So I finished up in court 3 or 4 times over the same arguments. And the biggest culprit was Fiordland National Park Sport. Mm. It had figured out how to probably get a royalty out of them. It signed everything off to Tim. That became an imbalance with regards to the rest of the country. It was like owning a bank. And as the animals, as you got it under control further afield, it became harder to make it work. So next minute, everybody looked at Fiordland and says, no way, Tim, you're not going to have that by yourself. And then the argument came out to the point whereby there was a real old crack with regards to the Minister, the Air Force, the police, forestry rangers and Fiordland National Park Sport rangers trying to protect Tim's asset in Fiordland.
Why had they, why were they so keen to protect that for Tim Wallace and Alpine Helicopters, which is just a commercial company like anyone else? Mm-hmm. What was the interest to keep it like that?
Well, I think you've got to read into it what you can because of the value of the product that was coming out, the royalties, and who was getting what out of it. And so therefore, you could sit there and say, right, Fiordland National Park Board had an agreement with regards to Tim and the shooting rights. Then when we researched it, was how much was he paying for the shooting rights? Bugger all. So what the hell was, we offered $1 million for the shooting rights at the end of the day. I just sat there and watched people go white in the face. But our demand was that $1 million had to be spent on park sport assets by huts, tracks and everything like that, nowhere else. Never ever went through. So I suppose it was, without getting too controversial, I suppose it was a matter of saying Kiwis being Kiwis. They could see a degree of unfairness in the whole thing. They could smell that there was something wrong. And so they wouldn't take no for an answer.
There's something you said. You had a meeting with the Minister of Ag and Forestry about the shooting rights. At that meeting, I asked a question that nobody could or was prepared to answer. It was, how come the government and its agencies are prepared to spend so much money to protect one man and his company interests? There was a stunned silence in the room as those present looked at one another, either unable or not wanting to answer the question. When that question wasn't answered, I made the statement, all questions have answers, although they may not be what you want to hear. And all problems have solutions, although not all will be happy with the outcome. Surely all this bullshit can be solved by a simple ballot. Remember, Kiwis all react well to fairness. I can assure you if a situation is perceived to be unfair, the problem will not go away.
That was on a Friday morning. And this, we were called to a meeting in Tiania. Ben Young was the minister. Everybody was there. And so on. But nobody would stand up.
And Keith being the troublemaker.
No, it was just looking at it logically and saying, look, it's not that difficult. Just let's have a look at it. There are questions that have to be answered. Answer them fairly and honestly, and I'm sure you'll get a solution. But if you don't, you won't. And it won't stop. So keep employing the Air Force, get the police, get whoever you like, but it won't stop. Because at the end of the day, it's a noxious animal. You're wanting to protect the park, we can clean it up really quickly. And it's now history. You don't really want to drag up some of the arguments that were going on within it, but they got fairly severe, put it that way.
I'm sure they did. Can we go back to when you first started flying the helicopters? Because I know when you first start flying, maybe the weather's a bit bad or something, we get a bit nervous and a bit worked up. But here you are with a brand new helicopter license, thrown in the deep end with virtually no hours to go and do this pretty demanding job. What was it like for you as a new pilot heading out there in your first few days? Were you shitting yourself or excited or?
No, it was just a job.
Or a bit naive or?
No, it was, how can I put it? I figured that the basic training that we'd got all the way through was fairly good. So at the end of the day, it was another aircraft to fly. So you flew it to the best of your ability and understanding, and you had confidence in yourself and your gear. So you flew to the conditions, and sure, you were learning by way of the odd fright on the way through some of the mistakes that you were making. Like I can remember one mistake that we did make, and I think Peter Brown was the shooter. And we were up the Landsborough, or coming back down the Landsborough to Makarora. And I used to fly with the chain on underneath, 8 foot length and what have you, because it was on and off all the time. So it was a bit wet and static electricity. The shooter would jump out and get a spark and swear like buggery, I'll just leave it on. Seen some deer coming down the side of a hill, as it was probably close to the mouth of the Landsborough, and swooped down low to cut them off, come in and snag the chain on the top of the beech trees that flicked up and went round the main rotor blade. Well, the bloody near threw us out of the air. Shit, talk about a wild horse. I don't know how yet, how I got control of it, but we did. And managed to get it down on the ground, and we'd cracked one of the main blades on impact. And I can still remember Pete, he wasn't going to get back in the aircraft. He said, bugger this. He says, fuck, he says, it's the closest I've ever come to dying. I've never been so scared in my life. Yeah. But if I think about myself at that point in time, you realized you made a mistake, and it was all about flying the aircraft. And so it was.
But you're only in your 20s, so you probably feel quite invincible too.
Yeah, you were confident in what you were doing.
Mm. Rightly or wrongly.
Rightly or wrongly, you went to work and you flew.
Mm. I often
And
feel...
you learn by experience and time.
Yeah.
And you get better and better at it, I suppose.
I often feel for those poor shooters when they're assigned a new pilot who's just got their license. I remember when I spoke to Ken Tustin, he said the same thing. I was assigned a shooter and we went out in the hiller and got into it. And I thought, that poor shooter, he's being chucked with someone with 150 hours total time to do a really hard job.
You didn't look at it as being hard.
Mm.
And the guys that were shooters, they were hunters. They enjoyed it. They loved the crack. They were lining up to get a job shooting off a helicopter. Like the toughest and best guy I've ever shot or had shoot for me was a fellow called Johnny MacIntyre. We're still friends. And we'd built up a relationship that says that we hardly spoke during the day, but we knew how each other was thinking. I'd just see his head move and I'd know he'd seen something or whatever, and I'd be there at the same time thinking. He wouldn't even have to give us a dig. The reason why I respect him is because we were about the first to go onto MacIntyre in an old hiller. And I can remember carting the first shooters through. We'd do a season on deer, and then I'd go into Mount Cook and round Fox Glacier for the winter. And that's it. After the MacIntyre, guys would, give up. So I was like a new shooter every year. Until Johnny done 5 seasons with us.
He seems like an interesting guy, Johnny, from Jacko, was that his nickname?
Yeah.
He wrote the foreword to your book, didn't he?
Yeah, I nicknamed him Jacko.
Right.
Because he reminded me of a guy that was called Jacko on Nightcaps, and he was a similar sort of character.
But you wrote something about him, and it started off just a very innocuous statement. Not having time to sit his license, Johnny bought a Piper Cub.
Yes.
Which is a bloody funny thing to say. He flew it around for years as an unlicensed pilot, and on more than one occasion worked with the Queenstown Police, Sergeant Malone, on search and rescue missions. He never submitted an invoice to the police in case they found out he was an unlicensed pilot.
That's true.
But this interested me. After arranging for a wheelbarrow to be parachuted into the Forgotten River Valley, he then walked into the Forgotten, retrieved the wheelbarrow, and with a shovel he dug by hand an airstrip. He then set to hunting deer for the meat and skins which were flown out by well-known pilot Tex Smith.
Mm.
And my mate Nigel Griffith and I spent a bit of time some years ago trying to find that airstrip.
Yes.
Up in the Forgotten. And we think we did, but it's, a bit hard now if you don't really know when it was. Yeah. But that was interesting to read that.
Yeah. No, well, that was him. And when he first went in, he was dropped in there sort of in around about February. Bag of rice and food and everything like that. His father never really wanted him to go hunting, as I understand it. Wanted him to pursue a trade. He was a carpenter. But he just loved his hunting. So mid-May and first snow, they thought they'd better go and see if they could find him, because the only thing Tex was, I understand Tex would go and pick up the meat and never see him. And then they finally pulled him out. The snow was right up to the apex of the little tent.
Wow.
Now, I never really found out the full truth behind the story until such time as I was looking at him one night. We were sleeping in the same motel together, and he always slept on his stomach. I said, don't you ever roll onto your side? Or sleep on your back? No. Why not? Oh, he said, when I put my pup tent up in the Forgotten, he said, it was dark and it was over a tree root. And I couldn't sleep on it. So he said, I never had time to re-pitch the tent, so I just lay on my stomach and slept across the top of the root. And to that day, he was still sleeping on his stomach.
Wow, he's a tough guy.
He was. He was incredible.
Yeah. So, there's quite a few funny stories around this guy, but you wrote a few pages about the induction procedure you put him through, and there was a photo of a pine tree at Queenstown Airport.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk a little bit about that, about getting him to jump out and him hanging in the pine tree, and how to get him used to that sort of side of it?
Well, it was like saying there was quite a few people wanted to shoot, but at the end of the day, you had to find out where their fear levels were and their skill sets were. And so there was a tree on the airport, and I suppose it all started off in Icart's hotel. When he turned up one night, we were sitting there having a beer, Gary Hollows and I, and we were short of a gutter. And this really quiet young fellow turns up, and he said, you helicopter boys? Yep. He said, I'd love a job in helicopters. Are you looking for anybody? And we were. So we talked to him for a bit, and he says, oh, well, we'll give you a call. I thought he's just another skid biter, we used to call him, tire kicker. And next day we talked about it and says, shit, we're short, we'll give him a crack. Well, he proved to be excellent. Then Gary, he moved on, and I needed a shooter. I mean, he was tough and so on. So it was a matter of finding out, okay, let's have a look at you. So the idea was you would take him out, lift off the ground by a metre, jump off the skid. Just 2 meters, jump. 3 meters, 4, 5, jump. Bugger was still jumping, and I thought, shit, he's going to break a leg and kill himself. He just goes straight out of the door and jump. And I thought, hell, I've got to stop with this. And then you pass that test. And I said, right, and sooner or later I'm going to finish up putting you out on a tree, and you've got to get down and come back up and get in. So over to the old pine tree. Look at the top of it. Flew around it. What do you think? Oh yeah, no problem. Pulled in with the skid. Jump. Here he is rolling on the ground. Oh, shook my head. I thought, well, he won't do that again. Get back in. Back up to the top. You made a mess of the last one. For Christ's sake, hang on. Jump. Out and about halfway down, he clings to it. And that was part of it. But then I remember coming in, we come back into the hangar, and we got a ring from the big guys in the tower. Well, the boss, it was a Don or somebody else, and says, geez, we've just had the tower on here. One of your pilots is out there with a young fella getting him to jump out into a tree. It looks like he's trying to kill him.
Must have been great entertainment for them.
Oh, they were laughing their heads off. But so that was proving what he could and couldn't do, and how good his nerves were, and so on. He went out as a load 3 times with me, hanging upside down on the hook, on the chain. Twice with a chamois horn. You see the horn of a chamois? Caught his boot as I was pulling out with a load, and he goes out hanging by his boot with the load.
And you had no idea he was there?
No, I knew, because something felt wrong.
Yeah.
Because you're pulling out backwards and rolling off the side of the hill, and it just didn't feel right. So I just kept on going and found a knob and lowered him down. Next minute he appears around the front of the bubble, the boot. Another time the chain took a half hitch around his foot. Finished up hanging onto the skid with the chain around his foot. Same thing happened a couple of times.
But like you say, that whole bond between the pilot and the shooter must have been something else. I mean,
it was.
Listening to this Deer Wars podcast, they talked about the same thing, and they said you didn't even need to signal each other. Just no communication of any sort. You just knew what each other's thinking, because it's life and death.
Yeah,
really,
you become closer to your shooter than you did to your wife. You knew exactly what he was thinking, and he knew what you were thinking. And more so, when you were chasing tar, when you were, once the pressure came on and the numbers reduced, then you were forced into steeper and tougher, higher country and so on. So you had to have absolute faith in each other.
If you were a timid, cautious pilot, would you be successful doing that? It's very aggressive flying, isn't it? Especially in that steep country, like you're saying. You've got to come to stop instantly, fire out the net or shoot the animal or whatever. And if you were a bit scared, it seems to me you just couldn't do it.
Well, I don't know. I've got full respect for all the guys that were involved in it. And obviously some pilots were better than others. And he used to say you had to have the ability to operate at 105% because you were at that level all the time because of the gear you were operating. So nobody's that good that they're not going to make a mistake. And sometimes the mistake caught the guys. You know, they'd clip a blade on a rock or something like that. Next minute they're down. And it's fast. So a timid pilot, yes, he probably would, but he might not be that productive. He certainly wouldn't have been productive in the end because of where you had to go and how you were chasing them. Like when I first looked at it, I thought maybe 3 years this will last for the numbers that we were taking out. Couldn't believe that we were still going 5 years later and still getting the numbers. So in reality, the whole country had underestimated the population and how big it was. And of course, 10 years later or 8 years later, we'd fairly well got on top of it. And then, you could see that guys were taking greater risks with regards to trying to survive, because at the end of the day, economics were going to sort the game out. You had to get so many per hour, else you couldn't cover the cost of the machine. Having said that, that forced us into live capture and deer farming, and hence a new industry. Yeah. And so it was the advent of that, and that was a whole new game again. And so live capture says that it survived. Then once the numbers got up to a certain level and the values adjusted, it sort of all come to an end shortly after that.
There was a big drama over a period of time with your service agreement with Alpine. And what you said after signing your contract, I just signed away my career as a helicopter pilot. This was to prove a significant hurdle when I eventually left the company. So what was that all about?
Well, initially, I think, it was just get somebody to fly a helicopter. Helicopter pilots in the late 60s, early 70s were like hen's teeth. And I think there would have been a commercial decision somewhere along the line saying that if we're going to provide the rating, we might as well try and sign the guys up, because one thing that we do not want is competition. So in trying to keep a ring around who was involved in the industry and what was happening then.
This being Tim Wallace.
Tim, yeah. It was in service agreements. So being young, and I suppose relatively naive, got talked into signing the agreement on the basis that it was good for them, good for the company, and good for you. Because if we can, by protecting the company, we're protecting your job and so on. So it was like...
And everyone signed the same agreement?
Some did and some didn't, because I think I was the first to test it. And it was quite funny at the time, because some of the guys that had signed it, when I suppose what brought it to a head, Larry Larrivee, who is a Canadian pilot, and I were the first to get involved with the Wapiti cull in Fiordland. So Larry and I were doing the shooting, and Blackie was, and a Jet Ranger was carting the loads back out. And we'd been going fairly hard from about, I suppose it was October, November, all the way through. And I was starting to get a bit tired. And Larry and I were sitting at the Frankton Hotel just over New Year, and we were both nattering away there, and I said, shit, I'm getting buggered. I said, I'm getting to the point whereby I know I'm going to make a mistake. I know I'm pushing my envelope too hard. And he said, I'm way past it. Of course, Larry'd come out of Vietnam, and he said, I felt a bloody sight safer in Vietnam flying over there than I do here. Wow. And he said, I'm about shot too. And I said, so I said, so what are you going to do about it? He says, I'm going to go and have a yarn to them. I said, well, I'm with you. Either we get a break, somewhere between now and the end of January, and, they can bring somebody else in to fly it, or else, he said, I'm out of here. And I said, well, same. I said, I know that, I just know mentally and physically I'm pushing it too far. That wasn't well received. And of course, Larry He was a free agent. I was young and subject to them providing the rating, which was not a great cost, but didn't realise in the fine print, I suppose, of the agreement that it actually gave Tim control of me, my licence, and ability to fly helicopters inside New Zealand.
So what did it actually say?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head now.
Did it prevent you flying from...
Prevented me flying a helicopter inside New Zealand.
For any other company?
Any other company. That was it. I was absolutely tied, handcuffed to Alpine. Well, for me, I hadn't come from that sort of a background. There was no way in hell that what I was doing belonged to anybody else other than me, especially my qualification. I was like saying, you'll do as we say, not what we do. So it was an ultimatum, saying, right, I want a break, so on. And then it push come to shove, and a long story short says that we couldn't agree. And so there was a series of weekly meetings, still couldn't agree. And then they offered me a lot more money to stay. And I said, it got to the point where I said to Tim, you offer me $1 million. I said, I work for you because I want to work for you. He said, money doesn't buy me. I said, I don't care how much you offer me. As far as I'm concerned, we're finished. And then out of the background come 2 or 3 other guys that had also signed agreements. They weren't game enough to have a crack at it, but they were hoping like hell I could break it so that they were clear. It culminated in me signing off on the Good Friday of that year. It was Easter Good Friday. Sat down with my wife and said, that's it, it's over. She said, what are we going to do? I said, I don't care. But I said, I absolutely need a break. And so I took time out, done a little bit of flying for a fellow called Nelson Thompson. It's a fisherman that had a 300, just to help him out more than anything. He'd been sitting around for about 9 months with a helicopter, no pilot. It was I sat back, and it was Consolidated Traders, Rex Giles, and a fellow called Mick Tundle. That was the Easter Monday. I'm going backwards and forwards a bit here. They come up and give me one hell of an offer to come flying for them, and I turned it down. And then it was about June. I rang up old Mick, and I said to him, is that offer still on the table? I said, I'll fly for you, but I said there'll be certain conditions attached to it with regards to time and interference. So I picked up, short story, I picked up their first hiller, HFG I think it was, brought it south. Before I'd left Auckland, I got a telegram from Tim. It wasn't a phone call, it was a telegram those days, saying that provided I didn't come below a line drawn sort of through Taupo, the top end of the North Island, they put, set aside the agreement. And so I just laughed at him. And then it was, if you don't come out of the North Island. And then it was a line drawn between, I think, Westport and Kaikoura. The line kept moving south until my final reply to Tim was, see you in Stewart Island. It was game on. And then there was, next one I got a knock on the door, and it was Don Sparry. You're served. They had managed to get a court. They tried in Christchurch and Dunedin to get me injuncted out of the air. And they finally got the judge in Invercargill to sign it off. So next minute, they had me injuncted. I couldn't fly, so I had to settle down and say, right, that's it for New Zealand. But I looked at it, read it for a bit, so I countersued him. I said, right, you fired your first shot. Here's the second shot. If we finish up in court, and should I win, I will sue you for all the costs and damages associated with that machine.
This must have been a huge risk for you, because Tim's obviously, I'm assuming, got a lot more behind him than you have at this stage in life.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. It was a principle. How? I still had life. So it rolled on. And of course, then we got the Karamea blocks and so on, up at Nelson Lakes National Park. So I looked at it for a bit, went for a couple of days shooting, got a heap, got a couple of numbers under her belt, and says, right, here we go. This is the court case. This is what we can achieve. Here's the weather patterns. And so I countersued him. And then there was a panic. We need to get this thing into court. So, well, I don't need to go to court because it's an old gamble. I'll win. If I win, you're up. You're writing the check. If you win, I just bugger off from New Zealand. I think you've got a much bigger risk than I have. I'll gamble. So I think it was October or something like that. There was a real panic because if I went through the numbers, through the period, Tim was going to have to pay us a bloody fortune. Mm. So we finished up in court, the High Court in Christchurch. And anyway, Monday morning, I think it was Calvin Marks was representing me. So there's Calvin and I sitting in the back of the court, and Tim with his full crew, 2 solicitors, and Don, and who was his accountant. I just forget his name now. I'll remember shortly. All lined up, and away we went. By midday, the judge closed the court down, no media, nothing. Old Judge MacArthur. So about 11 o'clock on the Friday morning, both sides had finished arguments and everything like that. And well, long story short, MacArthur had said, okay, be back here at 2 o'clock for my decision. 2 o'clock, we were back in there, and I can still see him standing up behind a big solid guy, standing up behind the court with his knuckles down in his board. And he looked down at Tim and he said, Mr. Wallace, what you're trying to achieve here will never be upheld within the British justice system. I find in favour of the young fella, and I give you the right to sue him for all damages caused. So Tim and I stood in the front door of the front steps of the court, and we were looking at him. He said, I suppose you're going to sue me. He said, you've got the ability to break us. I said, Tim, I don't want your money. Not even interested in it. I said, but I will put something together that challenges you. And I'll have more fun doing that than anything else, because it was a game. I said, you keep your money. And away we went from there. So Mountain Helicopters went from 1 machine through to about 15 operational. And, it was a New Zealand-wide operation. The base in Taupo, rebuilt hangar in Greymouth. And some of the best guys ever working for us. One of them just recognised the other day, Alan Mincher, probably one of the best engineers I've ever worked with. Skill sets.
Rangiora,
yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, West Melton. He was finished up our chief engineer, helped develop the net guns and everything like that. Magnificent brain on him.
So it became a bit of it seems like you and Tim had a wee bit of a head-to-head over the years over a few things, and it looks like it became a bit of a thing for you to break the Fiordland National Park monopoly. Would that be right?
Yeah, it was a game. It was part of the game. I was playing a game when I look at it, where Tim was probably chasing the commercial reality of operating a successful company.
Did you have... I mean, you really don't hear anything about God about Tim, apart from God, about Tim Wallace these days. Did you have a respect for him?
Of course I did.
Or would you call yourself enemies over in that time? Or
no, it was a game. It was commercial,
right?
And to me, it was a matter of looking at it had all the elements sitting inside it, from greed, envy, the whole lot, competition. You've seen what happened with regards to, on one side of it, you've got X amount of cost to operate a helicopter, and here's the earn on the other side of it. And so therefore there was...
So he's trying to maximise what he can do for his company
yeah.
And his interests, and you're on the other side doing the same?
Doing the same. And so it was, let's have a look at it. Make sure it's fair. It's just like playing sport. You can't have a good game of rugby if you've got a one-sided referee. And sooner or later, you'll know that the referee has screwed it up somewhere. So he's the guy that'll get the smack under the ear when you get off the pitch.
So there was I think probably a bit of poaching going on by yourselves and everyone else in the national park, and you were taken to court at one point. And the judge said, I'm convinced that you two are strangers to the truth. I like that term. But you've managed to create sufficient doubt in my mind that I've no option but to find you both not guilty. You're free to go. The next day we worked our way north, happy with the outcome and knowing full well we'd given the wasp nest an excellent poke. So this was a game, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And that was it. Because it was Johnny. I can remember going into court with him. I can still see it today. Calvin Marks was our solicitor, and Johnny went from very quiet to, I suppose you could say, a motor mouth. Great sense of humour, would take the piss out of anything, and that much bullshit that would fly from his mouth would confuse anybody. So prior to going into court, Calvin and I have got him. Johnny, yes, no. Do not vary. They ask a question, yes or no. It's a court of law. If you start trying to explain or tell your stories, you're going to get us into so much strife, it will be unreal. His head's going up and down, yes, I understand. We get into court. I'm on the stand for 2 hours in the morning. We adjourn for lunch, basically, as I remember it, and Johnny's on the stand after lunch. What a bloody shambles. Johnny got into his stories. Well, in the end, he had the judge confused. He didn't know whether we were in bloody Karamea or Stewart Island. There were maps everywhere all over the
all
bench.
Intentional, was it?
Yeah. Johnny has gone from the stand, being cross-examined, to standing up with the judge behind the bench with him trying to point out on the maps where we were. And the judge is still confused. That night, I think the case was scheduled sort of half a day, or maybe they'd taken a day out. I thought we'd be well cleaned up. Not with Johnny on the stand. It was adjourned till next day. I got the biggest shock of my life. Next minute, I'm called back onto the stand to explain Johnny's stories. Look, I tell you what, if we ever come close to falling out, Marx is pulling his hair out. By lunchtime, we've sort of half got it untangled. The judge is still confused, and hence we were both standing in there like a couple, like Jekyll and Jekyll, thinking, God, we're going to get smacked this time. And that's what the judge come up.
This is where the strangers to the truth come from.
I'm looking at you two, and you're both strangers to the truth. You've managed to create sufficient doubt in my mind. I've got to let this go.
Wow.
But I tell you, it was one of the funniest things I've ever seen.
But the whole national park fiasco, just caused enemies, really. I mean, there was some stories. Well, Alpine's hangar was burnt down at one point.
Yes,
right?
it got fairly hairy.
It wasn't you guys, was it?
No, I know who it was.
Do you?
Yep.
But it never came out who it was, did it?
No, probably to this day. There's about 2 or 3 of us know who it was. Had nothing to do with us at all. But there was.
But this is all the unfairness of it.
It was the unfairness,
like you said.
Yeah, it was escalating to the point whereby it was competitive. There was a lot of cash involved, and people were prepared to take greater and bigger risks to get access to that capital.
Yeah,
and it was. If it hadn't been for a ranger that was actually driving by around about 3 o'clock in the morning, that hangar would have burnt down. These guys had put a 44-gallon drum of gas into the front door of it and taken the cap off it. And the car came up the road and pulled up because it must have picked up, it's coming around the bend, picked up some lights or some people on the way off strip. So the tap off, running it in. So there would have been 2 or 3 helicopters in the hangar, would have been burnt down. but it took a long time for it to come out, but we know who it was. But nobody would say anything, you know.
Suitably fortified by food, coffee and tobacco.
Yeah.
What more does a man need?
Yeah, they got all the habits.
There's a few pretty cool stories that you relate in the book. I'm wondering if you could just mention again here. And the first one on my list is when you nearly shot up the Air Force doing their survival training. You were out tar hunting.
Well, we're in a spot that we shouldn't have been. Based out of Wataroa, we'd sort of given that catchment a fair sort of a doing over, and pickings were getting a little slim. So sitting in the Wataroa pub that night, we said, well, where to tomorrow? So looking at Jack, I says, we'll hop over the ridge. I said, we've given this side a fair shake-up. We'll better look at the Mount Cook side. Obviously different rules and regulations. So that morning over we go, and we're working this face. And you've actually got to see what it looks like, the tower up on this face. And what we did know was that if you got up level with the tar, as soon as you were level with them, they'd just peel off and downhill, and they could go down faster than we could actually auto-rotate. So the idea was to sit there in below them if you got onto a mob and just shoot just below your blade disc. So you were looking at shooting up at them all the time, but never above them. So we were working our way up this face, and unbeknown to us, there was a big plateau on top. Tar was still scrambling up in front of us, and shooter was going really well, picking them off, and down they'd fall, and we come right up to the ledge. The next minute, the mob that we were working went up and over the ledge and across this plateau, and I pulled up, ready to chase them across the plateau. And all of a sudden I looked and I thought, shit, it's funny. All as we could see was these blue, dark blue humps. And I looked and I thought, hell, people. They were digging. The hump on their back. It turned out it was the Air Force on a survival trip, camped out up on this plateau. And Johnny was an open-eyed shooter. A brilliant rhythm to him. He was just, you would swear the rifle was floating, and Tar got a very tough skin, so very accurate. He was just concentrating as they went over the top through this group. And I thought, Christ, peel off. And as you couldn't see any heads, they were just digging, trying to get themselves out of the road. So we peeled off, and what the hell was that? Turned out to be the Air Force. Woof, we were going back over the ridge and back to Wataroa. We thought, hell, we're going to hear about this lot. Sure enough, that evening, somebody'd been poaching on the Mount Cook side. No authority to be there. Hell, we went to ground. How the hell he didn't shoot somebody, I do not know to this day. And here's the Air Force boys digging their way into the snow, and here's the tar running between them.
And did they get you?
No, we just went to ground. And of course there was, the phones were going hot. Next minute, everybody was being rung. Who was it? Not supposed to be there. Just about shot the Air Force up, Could have been accidents and no accidents, deaths, and as I said, all hell broke loose. So we went to ground, never went back for quite a while.
Bet you didn't.
But I can still see it to this day. Yeah. How the hell we never shot somebody, I don't know.
Next one, when you were shot at by tar hunters and you got their tent.
Yeah, we were working up the Cook, and it was, again, just in under Mount Cook, right up in the, it was sort of up in the gods. We were working away, and I heard this boom, and I thought, what the hell was that? And then it was like a crack going past us, and it happened 2 or 3 times. And I said to Jack, I said, shit, there's something wrong. I said, it could be the transmission. Nothing showing on the gauges, but it was just this crack now and then. And I thought, hell, up the Cook, it's one valley you wouldn't want to walk out of. It's fairly rough, as I remember it. So peeled off, finished up landing back down on the glacier, runner up, couldn't get it to make, the noise again. So I said to Johnny, I said, look, no good staying in here. I can't get it to make the noise. Everything seems to be okay. I'm not walking out. I said, your choice. Stay here, but I'll fly her out, get hold of an engineer, see, I've got a feeling something's going to go wrong. No, I'm coming with you. So out we flew, Fox Glacier, got on the phone, run it up, tested it, done everything. We couldn't get it to make the same sounds again. And thought, come on, back in we go. So we got back in and started working, and next minute, bang, pop, pop. And I thought, shit, what is it? Then all of a sudden, it dawned on us, somebody was shooting at us. So there's hunters in here somewhere. Down we went, and quick look around, and we found the camp. I think there was 4 tents, and there was a setup. So obviously some hunters very pissed off with us being up there shooting the tar. And I suppose our nature was such was to hell with this. If they're going to have a crack, we'll see if they like that or what we're about to do. And Johnny said, what are you going to do? It doesn't matter. I said, went down to their camp, jump out, sleeping bags, everything, throw them in the river. Cooking utensils, everything in the river. What else are you going to do? So I've just put the skid in under through the apex in the tent, hauled it off, dumped them in the river. So we're out of here. It was about 2 days later. I said, whoever's here, I said, you're going to have a shit of a walk out because there's no food and it's going to be bloody cold. So 2 days later, late in the afternoon, we're sitting in the Fox Hotel having a beer, and next minute we've seen one of the vehicles. Oh, by the way, we found the vehicles and let the tyres down. Turned up and they went straight into the Park Sport headquarters by the airstrip. And I give Shooter a dig and I says, those guys have turned up. It was about half an hour later, they wander into the pub. They look like shit. And Johnny, with his sense of the humour, just give one of them a nudge as they're lining up having a beer beside us, and he says, oh, enjoy the hunting, boys. And then we got chapter and verse. We just sat there and listened, wandered off and had a laugh about it. But we never let on that we were actually the guys that had, tidied them up. But totally pissed off. It wasn't the first time that we'd been shot at, but I know, we'd picked up holes in the skids and what have you, and so on. But that was part of the game.
Yeah, crazy game. I was laughing when I read this one. There's a bit of a drinking culture, and some of your mates wanted to come back to your motel to carry on the party, and I think Johnny gave them the wrong room number. You remember that story?
Franz Joseph. Yeah. I'd been working rather hard, and we'd been down having a beer, and there was, I think it was a fellow Malloy, he was an electrician down there working. He was from Hokitika. And anyway, we were having a really good night, and it was about 9 o'clock, and he says, right, now we're off. We've got work in the morning. I'd been to work with hangovers before. No. I said, come on, we're out of here. Where are you staying? So I wouldn't give them the name of the motel, but Johnny told them the name of the hotel, but gave them the wrong room number. was about an hour later we heard a hell of a clatter going on. Anyway, they'd broken into the hotel about 3 along from us, and there was an old couple lying in bed. These pissed West Coasters looking for a party. You had to listen to their description as to what went on with the old couple. They finally tracked us, and I think it was one of the funniest things I'd ever seen. We had the doors locked. We weren't letting anybody in. And I'm sitting there and I could hear a noise in the toilet. And I looked at Jacko, and there was a little fellow, Stewie McLeod, one of the toughest little buggers that I've ever worked with. 2 piss spots high, but she had a heart as big as a horse. And I said, somebody's trying to get through the toilet window. I said, it's Malloy and Co, for Christ's sake. Well, both Stewie and Johnny bounced out of bed and went straight to the toilet. By the time I got there, I couldn't believe it. Malloy had managed to flip the louvers in the toilet window and taken 2 of them out. When Johnny and Stuart arrived into the toilet, here he is with his head stuck through the louvers, obviously standing on something outside, trying to figure out how to get in. Well, Stewie was quick enough. He just dived straight at it, hit the louver lever, and jammed them shut. So Malloy's stuck there with his head through the window, and it's like a cow in a bale. He couldn't get out, couldn't go forward or back. When I got there, Johnny's got him by the nose. He'd already pissed in the toilet. He'd shaken the toilet brush around, and he's holding him up trying to clean his teeth with the toilet brush. Well, the bloody ruckus and the roar. That was go. I think we eventually got thrown out. We lost our accommodation the next morning. Yeah.
Surprising.
Yeah, but I can still see it. And every time we've seen Malloy after that, I look at him and say, how are the teeth? You'll have got rid of the stains. But,
didn't you say they threw a dead tar head in the window in the book as well?
Yeah, they did. They threw that through first. I think that's what we heard. We heard something go clatter into the room, and it was a dead tar head come through the louver.
Wow. In the last one on my list here, there was a pack of Christchurch detectives that you dealt to.
Oh, that was Billy Winefield and Robin Taylor. Robin finished up shooting for us, but Bill's nickname was Pancho the Bandit, and that was up the Lewis Pass area. And if I remember right, anyway, they'd been up there hunting. Boys had come through in the helicopter. So the hunters had no luck, totally pissed off. And of course, they come driving back down the road, and here's the helicopter and a heap of deer next door to it. Driving by, the windows were down, mouthful of abuse and giving them the long finger and God knows what. So Pancho took exception, and Taylor. So they loaded some deer guts onto the racks on the side of the machine, chased them down the road and behind them. And anyway, as they were driving just above them, they started offloading the deer guts.
Onto the car.
Onto the bonnet and the windscreen. This is going down the main road, throwing it off. And anyway, they finished up back at, I think if I remember rightly, they were staying at Hamner. But anyway, it was a day later or something like that. Next minute, the police had arrived up there. Robin and Billy had got wind of it. As I can't really remember, but they were in hiding, and it turned out that they'd thrown the guts on top of a whole heap of, or half a dozen detectives from the police force, or from the police in Christchurch. But that was a standing joke for a long time. But it was shortly after that Pancho had to do a runner. I think he just got out and got to Australia. They were going to throw the book at him, but I think it was a race to the airport. He was on a flight out, and the police were looking for them in the airport. But it's one of those stories.
Oh, that's great.
Time goes by, and you forget a lot of the detail.
A few times in the book, you talk about power settling, and I just thought it'd be interesting just to talk a wee bit about it. But what was quite interesting to me is you had a bit of a procedure where if you gave the shooter a nudge in the ribs, he had to jump.
Yep.
And you talk about Stuart McLeod. You said one thing that I stressed when I was putting him through his basic training was that if I elbowed him in the ribs, he was on his way out the door, as he'd be much better off rolling around in the snow than staying in the machine tangled up in the wreckage. So what's power settling, and what was that procedure about?
Well, power settling, there was two sides to that. Power settling is when, you get into your own vortex and everything reverses. You're flying into dirty air, and your rotor discs go in, and next minute everything lets go. The only way out of it is to go through the bottom, and you've got to get clear air back into your rotor blades. And those spots where we were working, not a good thing to get into. So you're conscious of it, and albeit you were taught about it, until you've actually really experienced it, you don't realise how lethal it could be. But first power settling was newly trained, and the shooter was Evan Waby. We were operating up the Clintons, just south of Milford. Had a big stag coming off a face, massive rack on him, and it was as steep as anything. Didn't realise that I had wind up my chuff as we were following the stag down the side of the mountain, trying to get him onto a spot whereby we could recover him because it was that steep. Sure enough, we shot him, but I'm drifting down with the wind up my chuff, and then, unbeknown to me and not having a great deal of experience, just as we shot it, I got into power settling. So I'm facing the mountain, drifting down beside it, making sure that my shooter can get the shot, and the next minute she let go.
So you just fall out the sky?
Fell out the sky, bang, everything reversed. Still not sure how we got out of it, but I can remember when it hit, and I suppose it was an instant reaction. It was cyclic hard back, and I just kicked the tail rotor round as we fell. And so we finished up falling down the side of the cliff, very close to it. How we didn't hit, I don't know. Got clear air and flew out, but it was really quick. And it seemed forever, trying to get the bitch to fly again. And we drifted across the valley and landed up above Glade House, sat there. Evan's as white as a sheet, and I don't think, I'm not too sure whether I needed to change underclothes or not, but I'd got one hell of a fright. I smoked a bit, mainly bludged them. Evan had a packet of Rothmans in his pocket. We cleaned up the packet of Rothmans before we got back in. He finally settled down, and we finished up back at Cascade. But after we worked it out, we were, back in the air and way shooting again.
But the thing about nudging the shooter in the ribs is that to reduce weight.
Reduce weight, get him out of it. If he's sitting in there and we're in a tight position, if I say go, you go, and I don't care.
Jumps.
You jump, because you'll survive, but you're better off out of where we are. We coming across a ridge on the northern side of Wataroa, up the Perth. We hit it bad one day too, and that was with Stuart McLeod. But part of his teaching was that we were flying up Fox Glacier, and it was one of those dirty grey days where everything merged. And it was like whiteout. Whiteout is really quick. And if you get caught in a whiteout, it's just a snap. You're gone. So we're drifting up over the glacier, a grey day. Couldn't really sort out where the snow was and the cloud and so on. It had just merged. And so we're flying along, and I thought, we'll test Stewie. So I give him a nudge. Well, he was so quick. The door was open. The next minute he was out on the skids. But before he went, he had a little pack. They always used to have a little pack. And as he was going out the door, he threw it. And I watched this thing go, shoo, 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 shoo. We had to be 150, 200 foot up. It was just on the verge of whiteout. So I'm roaring at him, trying to get him back into the aircraft. He's dancing around on the skid like a chamois, holding onto the door, eyes as big as saucers, and I didn't know whether he was going to jump or come back in. To this day, he still reminds me of it, standing out there, and he said, I'm looking back at you and you're roaring at me. I'm thinking you're saying jump and you're saying get back in. So it was total confusion. But he didn't jump, and if he had jumped, well, shit, he was married with 4 kids.
Wow.
That wouldn't have been a good outcome.
Yeah.
But you've got to get him to tell you the story.
But, maybe we will.
And when I realised it was whiteout and so on, it was then a matter of focusing on something to ensure that we could come back round, get your balance to go pick him up. But we were again, we got into it coming across a ridge, as I said, north of Wataroa, and we hadn't been having much luck that morning. So we went over the ridge and sort of into the head of the Little Wanganui. Managed to get 4 stags on, but the wind was coming in from the east and was rolling over the top. Coming up to the edge of the ridge, trying to edge up to get back over it with 2 on board and a load. Struggling, got up there, next moment we got into a roll. She half-pipe powered, settled, and away she went. So that worked that time because Stewie was closest to the hill. Jacko was on the opposite side, much bigger jump. Nudged him, he just went straight out. Rolling down the hill. Jacko wasn't far behind him, and then got back out, got rid of the load, come back in and picked them up. But still remember it. And
You do.
Yeah,
it's
it was
just
quick,
hard to
though.
appreciate how close to the terrain you are. You know, if these guys can just jump and survive,
Yeah,
you know, yeah,
they had to be fairly athletic,
yeah.
especially
I
chasing
bet
tar.
there were some injuries.
Yeah. A lot of injuries. Some of them got fairly badly hurt. I know when Johnny finished up, we had we were up under Mount Aspiring, and I can still see the chamois running across this ice face. It was 26 of them. We shot them, and anyway, it was coming back round to recover, come in and drop Johnny off. Now you've got to understand, we're sitting up on a fairly big ice floe on the face. Below that, there's a ledge that's, I suppose it was about 2,000 foot down. If it went over the edge, that was it. But he never moved. He just stayed splayed, arms out, and I thought, shit. He'd frozen. And this is, he'd been with us a long time. So we had a loud hailer in the front of it, and I knew he was really in trouble. So hovering past him, I kept talking to him through the loud hailer, and I said to him then, I said, Johnny, all I want you to do is stand up. Just stand up. Don't move. Just see if you can stand up. I said, if you can, you will find me right beside you. I'll have the skid coming in right alongside you. Just turn, get hold of it. Tried to stand up, got in. It took me 45 minutes to get him off the face.
Wow.
Long story short, but eventually he stood up, skid was there, turned around, grabbed it, and he was in. But he was grey, absolutely grey, shock, and that was about the end of it for him and his career, shooting with me anyway. And took Merv Hewlett up straight after to try and recover the animals. Animals are still there, had the same problem with Merv. So.
What was it like when the 500 first turned up? You must have, gone often from a hiller straight into a 500, did you?
Yeah, well,
That must have been like night and day.
Massively like night and day. First 500 come through was Mel Kane in a 500, and we were at Makarora. And anyway, I'd never seen one at that point in time. Heard about them, seen pictures and so on. And this thing came whizzing through. Stayed in Makarora that night. We all had a beer. Mel was up and gone in the morning. Well, there was just no way in hell that we could keep up with him in that 500C and us in the old hiller. So that was a turning point. it was the first time you had something that would deliver power at altitude and give you the ability to actually work at a higher altitude than, well, safely at the altitudes we're working at, especially around Mount Cook. So it absolutely was a game changer. And so then it was a matter of trying to get them into the country. We never had what you would call an air service license because we were purely a venison company. So unless you had an air service license, you couldn't import. We managed to get a couple in, and then the regulations were such we couldn't import a third. We had to demonstrate to ag and fish and civil aviation that if they gave us an import license to bring one in, we would demonstrate that we could pay for the machine and everything else that went with it without interfering commercially with anybody else's operation, whether that be spraying, ag, heavy lifting, or so on. We were not a competition to Helicopters New Zealand or anybody else that was operating in the game. Eventually, we got it. We bought one in, or we got the next one in. Then we went after possums, and we put a deal together in Nelson Lakes National Park and around Karamea and through there, chasing possums. So we talked. It was Owen Gruby, I think we had at Motueka. He arranged a meeting amongst the local hunters. We had it in a pub, and we put an operation together whereby we would hunt for the possums and the skins, bring them out. They would tack them on a couple of wool sheds, dry them, and then we would take them off to Consolidated store in Wellington, and they were charged with selling them. We never envisaged the number that would be available. Our operation was that we would cart the hunters, drop them off on the ridge line. They would feed a line, with bait, and the third feed with cyanide in it, and they would just go downhill, skinning as they went, and we'd pick them up on the bottom again. The first lows that we done, guys never turned up at the bottom. Finally, they came in and they said, "Look, there's just so many possums. We just can't carry them down. We can't skin fast enough. It's impossible." So then we introduced wool packs. We set them up with long strops and so on. So they just dragged downhill the packs, throwing possum carcasses in. We'd lift them out, take them out to Motueka, and tidy them up from there. But we paid for 506 weeks.
Wow.
With regards to the skins that we took out of there. And that, people talk about. Before that, I think when I first run into possums, you weren't allowed to hunt or shoot them. They were sort of a half-pipe protected animal.
Which seems unbelievable now.
Unbelievable to the point that nobody actually realised how many there were and how the population had taken off. So still a problem.
In 76, you took on the chief pilot and the ops manager role for Mountain Helicopters and moved to Greymouth. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the training methods? Because I think you did a lot of the training.
Yeah, we had some really good pilots, the likes of Howard Smith and so on. Howard had a couple of good accidents and what have you, knocked himself around. But then it was a matter of getting the crews together. And so I had a position in my own head that says pilots were pilots. First of all, they were trained to fly and they'd know how to look after the aircraft. But we wouldn't convert a hunter to a pilot because having done it or seen it happen a couple of times, the hunters, once they got onto an animal, would start forgetting about the machine. This is as far as I was concerned. And so therefore the accident rate started to climb. So it was horses for courses. So part of our training was that we made sure that the guys were right up to speed. They were pilots. They understood the mechanics, the aerodynamics, and how to wear a machine. So we'd teach them to wear it to the point whereby it started off from the fact that you strap yourself into it and you strap it onto you. So you have to feel and understand what's going on. You have to hear it, and you have to listen to all the signals. It's not like a fixed-wing aircraft whereby you've got stall warning horns and everything like that, because your conditions change and they vary. So if you're wearing it and you can feel it and don't over-control it and just become part of it, it'll look after you, providing you look after it. The long story short, for about 5 years, when the accident rate was really high, we never had a claim. And the first accident that we had with mountain helicopters was one of our guys, Les Mars, run out of fuel close to Haas. He just stayed out too long. In reality, there was no excuse for running out of gas, but that was it. So while there was, I think, if I remember rightly, there was about a third of the machines lost every year, or thereabouts. If you had 15, you were going to lose 5. Well, we went for about 4 to 5 years without losing a machine or having a claim. But it was, I think, all down to training and understanding and making sure that the guys absolutely wore the aircraft. I left Mountain, and after that went back down to Fiordland, and we picked up Alpine Helicopters, which we welded together with Mountain. And then I can remember saying to Mick Tyndale, who was boss of the company at that point in time, that you be careful with regards to the guys that you hire, because remember, a hunter is a hunter.
Yeah.
First and foremost, he's a hunter. That's where his adrenaline runs. That's where the excitement is. Train your pilots well, and you'll get it together. And then it was a number of years later, after Mick was in retirement, he lined us up once. We're in the pub having a beer, and he says, sorry, he said, I made a mistake. He said, when you left, he said, we started taking on hunters. And then their accident rate went through the roof.
Wow.
And I think if you had a look at the company's stats, you'd see it as it unfolded. But it was being driven commercially at that point in time. It was a matter of the more machines, the better. And it was all based on animals, just get us the animals. So in my head, it was more about the training.
So at some point, maybe in the late 70s, was it that the process moved from shooting to live capture?
Mm-hmm.
Can you remember when you first heard of this crazy idea?
Well, we knew that, to survive, we had to do something other than hunt, because we just weren't getting the numbers, and the operation wasn't stacking up. So the processor and exporter probably were doing okay, but the guys operating machines their margins were getting squeezed tighter and tighter, and then we were starting to hunt in areas that we shouldn't have been. The guys, hunting at night, spotlighting with a helicopter, and so on. You're asking for trouble. Yeah, you were being pushed hard. So all of a sudden I was saying, look, here's the product. We understand what it is. We've got to start catching them alive, because we think that farming the animal based on the returns for cattle and sheep makes far more sense than, the domestic animals. Let's start putting them behind fences. So that's where it started, but I think it was Bill Black was sort of the first to have a crack at it, or one of the first. I think it was him and Jimmy Kane, was it? But anyway, they started off with a long pole and a dart on the end of it, full of fentanyl. That's another story, it's quite a long one. But that wasn't too successful, so we were right behind them with regards to, big old long pole, put a dart on the arse of the deer, it'll knock him over, and away we go from there. Well, I know with ourselves, it was not Joe Keeley, Indian Joe. That was his nickname.
Joe Collins?
Joey Collins, yeah. Joey Collins and Tommy Travers. They were having a crack with a 300 down around Waikaia. And caught a couple, the long bamboo pole. Next minute, things are not going too good. Pole hit the ground and it went up through the blades. Next, still not going too well. Pole's hit the ground and it's jacked Joey out the door like a pole vaulter. And then, okay, we'll keep working at it. What about the pole with the loop on it? So we got lasso them. So Doctari, that was an old movie where you'd seen in Africa, these fellas running around on a Land Rover, somebody sitting in the front with a long pole and a loop trying to catch various animals in Africa. That'll do us, and away we went. That was okay until Joey put the loop over a deer and got the rope caught over the front of the skids, and they somersaulted the 300 into the side of the hill. So I've still got photographs of them pulling it out. And then it moved from there into drugs. And then it become, there was about 3 of us had a license to import and handle fentanyl, commercial use. We all got fairly nervous because, at that point in time we used to carry morphine and that around in our kit. If somebody went down and broken legs or anything like that, you needed morphine because we didn't have satellites and everything like that. You could have been lying there for quite a while in pain. So with the introduction of fentanyl, all of a sudden, if that got out and we were using drugs, then the machines become vulnerable to the point whereby, hang on, the damage done by people wanting to raid our kits. As such, we've got to change it. So it was kept really quiet. That's what we were using. And we started farting around with one of the mixtures that we came up with, and it worked extremely well in the end because fentanyl overdosed, deer getting having an adrenaline run, would snap into it really quick. The dose of fentanyl to knock them over forever increased, and we knew that you had about 20 minutes to get an antidote in it, or else the deer would die or get what they would call wry neck.
Oh, you had to antidote them.
Had to antidote them and so on, and if you didn't get the antidote into them fast enough, they'd die on you anyway with wry neck. It was just that they were overdosed. So there was a balance, and we had to get it to work quickly. And so then we started mixing it with rompin, and then I got into a product. It was actually, did I pick it up? I think it was in a tau. One of the vets said, have you tried this particular dispersant? I think it was, the short name for it was DMSO or something like that. And I can remember sitting at the vet's, and he said, try this, and he put it on the end of my finger, and within 5 seconds I could taste it.
Wow.
And he said, it's a dispersant. It may disperse the drug quicker and you'll get to it faster. By putting the rompin in, it would reduce the amount of fentanyl going in. So that worked for a bit, and then from then on, it was dart guns, and then it was darts with radios, signals.
And there was
in
the
them.
deer, right at the start, there was the deer jumping.
Yeah.
Just leaping onto the things.
Yeah. Well, you had to be careful because if they jumped, they'd take you down. Like I can remember when the net guns first come in, the old gotcha guns, and Mountain Helicopters and Alan Mincher were the guys that actually set off. Alan built a cannon. Talk about clever, 4-barreled cannon, and we kept that under wraps up in Greymouth. He had it to the point whereby you could suspend it from the rafters. It was firing 4 weights, 2 at a kilo and 2 at half a kilo, with a massive net stuck in the front of it. I can show you photographs of it. But it was recoilless. Oh. You could hang it from the beams, pull the trigger, no recoil.
Wow.
And out it would go. Spectacular. And it was from there that Ivan Wilson and, what's his name? From Reefton anyway, they were hanging around the Mountain Helicopters hangar for a bit. And then they developed the first net guns called a gotcha gun. And I can remember Ivan bringing it down to Hiroka, and us testing it down there under wraps. Kicked like a bloody mule. Shit, just about had to have 3 shooters. But hell, was that effective. That was the start
That's the game changer, was it?
That was a massive game changer. Nelson Thompson from Tiana, local boy, developed a 3-barreled one, shooting a triangular net. Absolutely nailed it. Beautiful weapon, bit of equipment.
Must have been pretty exciting times.
Because it was.
Is this just a free for all? Develop, try. Was the CAA interested, or did they know what was going on?
With the cannon that Alan developed, we had to then we looked at it and thought, Christ, if we have an accident with this, and it's not registered to attach to the helicopter, it's going to negate insurance. We're going to have all sorts of arguments. So we've actually got to get civil aviation to sign off on it. So we had to demonstrate, and finally we got them to sign off to the extent that we could fit it underneath the 500. I think Les Mars caught the most in going up a slip. I think with that big net gun, he caught, I think it was 6 in one shot. But he said, it doesn't work. He said, there's such a tangled bloody mess, it took us all day to get them out.
Legs and antlers.
It was just a mess. So we knew it had to come back down to what you would call the single one. So the big one worked extremely well, but it was from the gotcha gun, it was down back to Nelson Thompson's 3-barreled one. But as I said, the gotcha gun cost me bloody near a rebuild on the Hughes 500. Little fella Rick Stent. I had two guys. They're both like jockeys. They were lightweights, tough. Yvonne Rue and Rick. Rick, since he got killed in the end, but he was. The guys were broken knuckles, bruised fingers, skin. So they'd take them out. They'd last a day. You'd have to have somebody else in the next day because of the damage being done. And I couldn't understand Rick. As I said, built like a bloody jockey, and there was no damage. Accurate, bloody great shooter. Anyway, we've done about 50-odd hours, and I finished up going into Momona on check. And the boys give me a ring and says, hey, your airframe's poked. What the hell do you mean? It's the doorpost. What's wrong with the doorpost? The door's shut, everything like that. No, it's all buckled. What Rick was doing, he was putting the butt of it against the doorpost and shooting from there. But it absolutely screwed up the airframe. Cost me a bloody fortune to get it fixed. So it's cheaper for you to blow up the knuckles than for you to blow it out. But he was, both him and Yvonne, Rick was really good. I remember we were in the Watt blocks, and we had this big stag sitting away up on a face. Thought, right, we'll have a crack at him. And we had the 3-barreled net gun. This was one of Nelson's at the time. And I said to Rick, right, they've got a habit to jump. He's on his way downhill. I said, we'll get one pass. I said, I'll put you in a position whereby one shot head on, that's it. But I'll be watching like a bloody hawk. If he jumps, he hits us. He'll knock us out of the air. So down we come, stag in full gallop, timed it to get in front of him. Rick threw himself out the door, let go. The shot didn't go off, he just disappeared. Like, where the hell's he gone? What had happened is his seatbelt had come undone. He hit the skid. We had long skids. All as I felt, I could feel it in the cyclic. Something went out of balance. He'd rolled round the skid and finished up hanging off it. Gun was gone, and I knew from the cyclic that there was something wrong. So I just kept on going down. Next minute, close to the hill, Rick pops up back into the machine. What happened? He said, I don't know. He said, I just fell out. So we looked at everything. We couldn't figure it out. I don't know whether we found the gun or not. And anyway, back that night, we're going through the machine. How the hell did you fall out? So we're up the head of the Clintons, and I tell you what, this is one of the best landings I think I've ever seen in my life. In soft ground, sort of semi-swampy ground at the head of the Clinton, just up from Glade House, right at in the headwaters. Here's a hind and a fawn right out there. I thought, shit, this is dead easy. And behind it, I said, we'll get the hind first, then we'll get the fawn straight after it. He's not going to go far. And behind her, she's galloping along, and next one he throws himself out the door. Bugger it, he disappears again. What the hell? And next minute, as I'm pulling up, flaring, because he's taking the shot, out he goes in front of me. A perfect landing. 2 knees, both elbows and a nose, through the swamp. He was like a double-furrowed plough. There was bloody water and shit went everywhere. Thank God it was a swamp. He would have killed himself. And got him back, and he just shook himself off and started to laugh. And he said, I don't know. He said, I just fell out. He said, the bloody belt let go. But what had happened is that on check, they'd taken the seat belts out, checked them to make sure that they're all in good conditions, put them back in. They put them in the wrong way round. And when he threw himself out the door, he clicked the latch, and it became undone. Of course, he was relying on it to hold him in. No support.
That's what happens when engineers muck around with things.
Yeah, so he toppled out.
You sent me some stats about the pilot and shooter deaths, which were pretty sobering. So from your time in the ag and venison industries over about 15 years, 51% of pilots were killed, and of the remaining 16% were seriously injured, and in the shooters 57% were killed, and of the remaining 14% were seriously injured. Yeah. Crazy numbers.
They were crazy, but at the time you didn't realise it, and it wasn't until such time as I sat down to write, and then thinking about the people I knew or who I'd been involved with, and then you start putting together, and you just, I started putting the names just on a spreadsheet where they finished up. But they were the numbers that popped out.
But you must have been going to funerals every other month.
Start of the season, there was always a lot of funerals, a lot of big wakes. They'd be 3 days. But then it was straight back to work. And
there was one, we drove through the Haas Pass last night.
Yes.
And I was thinking of Tony Hawker, because you mentioned that being a 3-day wake.
Yeah.
And we drove past the Roaring Billy, and I'm looking up there.
Yeah,
where he was killed, and you told a whole story about going to look for him. And again, my mate Nigel, he owns Tony's Piper Cub now, BOY.
Yes.
So there's a little connection there.
Yes. Well, we were at Pine Grove when Tony went down. So there was, as I said, there was Blackie, myself, and who else? There was about 3 of us going. Rex Dovey. Rex was engineer come pilot. He was sort of looking after this area, and then Tony came along after me, and then he was based out of Haast. So for me, it was from the head of the Lake Tiana up to the Pike, bottom end of the Cascade, and then I would overfly him into Paringa and hunt north, and Tony, he looked after those, that area around Haast. And it was, one night it was about 11 o'clock, pissing down with rain. Black as the inside of a cow's gut. And anyway, the phone goes, and Tony hadn't turned up. So it was, if somebody went missing, everything went to a stop. You had to go find them. So we cranked up that night, and bloody near come to grief myself. Took off from Pine Grove straight to the coast and got onto, when you know what it's like at night, flying down this, you can follow the sea and you follow the phosphorus, on the breakers. And heading south, and forgot about a peninsula that was sticking out, then all of a sudden run out of it, and I was pitch black. How the hell we got round and how we didn't go in, I don't know. But anyway, got back onto it, got round to the Roaring Billy. There's no way in hell.
This is at midnight?
Yeah, this is midnight, and met a couple of the guys there up the head of the Haas. There was just no way in hell we could get in, so we called it quits. And it was, as day was breaking next morning, and we went, and it was Petey Stevens was his shooter, and I look back, and even then do not know how in the hell he came out from where he did in such conditions It was like a superhuman effort, and to alert us that he'd been knocked over. So he told us where to go look. We found him all right, but then rivers were up. Who was it? He lives in Blenheim. Guru. He was the gutter. He alerted us, and then I can remember that's right. It was with Pete Brown. Found the machine, couldn't get him beside it. Decided he'd knocked his tail rotor off and fell down upside down, hit a big log. Other than a bang on the head, he was in perfect condition. But the rivers were up as such that Guru was, going to go across one of them and to try and get to him. So there's no way in hell it's going to be 2 deaths. We'd have lost him. So we pulled back, and I think Tim turned up with Don Sparring, and eventually, he got pulled out. And I think I arrived home that night about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 o'clock. Wife wondered why the hell I was at home. Had a few beers at the hangar, I was fairly sad. Got home, I must have went to sleep on the chair and woke up on the floor in the morning, absolutely stuffed, because fairly big day. But that was Tony. Big wake and a lot of people.
Yeah. Nigel and I went for a visit some years ago down to the Haast Beach store. Don't think it's open anymore. And they had a wall of photos of everyone in the venison industry that had been killed over the years.
Yeah.
Just rows and rows of photos, which was pretty sobering. What else did I have? I don't want to labour this too long, but one other thing was the drinking culture that you hear a lot about in those times. You refer to beer as nectar from the gods, or mother's milk from the rusty tit, or of a glass of cleansing ale. It was just a thing back then, was it?
It was.
And was it to ease the nerves, or just what you did?
No, it was part of the camaraderie, I think. It was like, when it was fine, you worked hard. Being the coast, a lot of wet days. So more often than not, if the weather came in, meeting place was the hotel. So being competitive, and when I started, there was, as I said, helicopter pilots were like hen's teeth. So there was only about 4 or 5 of us sort of operating in the South Island. But as the numbers increased, all of a sudden, we had Southwest turn up. They took over Pine Grove motels, and the numbers expanded. There was more and more machines turned up in Haast. So wet nights, it was always to the pub. And we'd have great nights, a lot of camaraderie and a lot of piss-taking, and, making your own fun and enjoying life. If I went back to my ex-wife now and asked her about the time she spent in Haast, I reckon she'd go back there tomorrow.
Really?
And myself, like we were living in Queenstown, and I would come out from Haast, and because we'd be away a fortnight or whatever, and then the first thing you'd have to do is recourt your wife, and we'd go around to Gantley's restaurant and say, right, we'll have crayfish. So you get this little crayfish, and a few days old, and you think, oh, and you were sitting in Haast, you lived off it, crayfish, fish, and you made your own fun.
Because the other thing that I don't think people realise is you're all earning big dollars.
Yes.
Big dollars.
Yes.
So there's no shortage of cash to blow on alcohol and crayfish. And
I bought my first farm with 1 year's salary, and I still had money left over. There was 400 acres at the back of Nightcaps, and that was lock, stock and barrel.
Right, moving on. We've threshed that to death, but it's pretty interesting. You got out of it all after 13 years, and I think previously you had invested in an aquaculture industry in Marlborough with your brother. When did you sort of transition in your mind from the pilot hunter lifestyle to an entrepreneur? Because it's just like two halves of your life. There's the flying and now there's the business life.
Yeah. Well, I was coming around the bottom end of the South Island and looking at the instrument panel and thought, if I'm still doing this when I'm 65, if this is my life and I'm doing it till I'm 65, I've missed something. So then it was like a subconscious decision to say, hang on, there's got to be something else out there as well. And we'd already started the aquaculture business with the green shell mussels in Melbourne. So 3 days later, that was it. I just called it quits, and it was like...
Just like that?
Just like that. But 6 months or after that, I missed aviation so bad that I went back in. I picked up a D model Hughes 500 on a 50-hour contract sort of thing. I flew that, and then I realised for me it was over. Because by the time I'd completed that, I couldn't get out of it fast enough. I thought, no, there is something else to life other than this, and I've got to go look. So then it was a thrill of developing, we called it Melbourne with my brother, and that taught me a lot about our system and having a go at a new sunrise industry. Now, the funny thing about it was that floating around those sounds with Henry Buchanan and an old fellow called Frank Delaney in the initial stage, eating mussels and scallops, and these mussels I thought tasted just about as good as bluff oysters. And it was, there has to be a market for this. They taste so good.
But this is in the days well before, there's no mussel industry.
No mussel industry, that was the start of it. And so it was from there that we went on the adventure of developing that. And so I started it, and then got my brother, who was living in Timaru at the time, a carpenter, come shearer, come whatever. He'd sort of followed me in a lot of the things that he'd done. And said, I think there's an opportunity. If you want to take the risk, come to Melbourne. And so with his skill sets from building and so on, and between the two of us, I still had a fairly high earning capacity, and so as a matter of capital and energy, we started. And it was a bit like catching live deer. We didn't really know how to go about it. We knew that if the mussel spat settled on ropes, and if you could get enough of it, you could grow it out and it would stick to the rope and you could harvest it. So in the first instance, it was, we learned how to, the areas within the Marlborough Sounds that through tide and wind, there was concentrations of mussel spat at a certain time of the year. You could drop your ropes in, and if you were lucky, mussels would settle it. You would take it away, but you had to find an area to farm it in. That time, there was no such thing as a license or a lease, but we were applying for a lease, so that we could get a space and water. That was our first introduction to Wellington's bureaucracy, trying to get that off the ground. And then I realised that it was very similar to what we were doing with venison. Like our biggest competition in venison was forestry, colours, and a bureaucracy and an industry that was government run out of Wellington. At times I think they didn't want us to succeed because what it was doing was dismantling something that had already been put together and was protected by government. We were outsiders. Now, to do this inside the fishing industry, the first thing we looked at was saying, well, it's the natural reserve and an area of the fishermen, those guys that go to sea. And the first penny that dropped in my head, and I dare say my brother at the same time, was that, hang on, this is farming the sea. So let's have a look at the fisherman. He's got a boat, he's got a net, he goes to sea, he trawls, he catches, he comes ashore, sells his fish, goes to the pub and goes back to sea. That's not farming. That's the same as the venison industry. So if we think that this has got a chance and we can manage the process, let's have a go at aquaculture. But we figured it was the domain of the fishermen, and they were probably the natural developers of it. But it turned out, in my mind, they weren't. You had to have that mindset of a farmer. It's like you putting your ram out you get your lamb, you nurture the lamb, and finally you've got a 17 kg carcass hanging on a hook that you can sell. Mussels were the same. So we already had a pattern there, but we just had to get the area. So after a lot of arguments and with the bureaucracy based on the fact that nobody was farming the sea was international territory, our biggest opposition were the fishermen saying, no, we reserve the right to our freedom to go anywhere. We don't want to see farms inside our right to fish. So it was brand new. So we just had to keep going in and chip away and chip away and chip away to the point whereby we finally got a lease. And then it was a matter of saying, we can grow them, but what are we going to sling them off? Do we get an old barge or a boat?
And this is what I don't think we sort of realise in today's day and age, because, you know, often if you want to find something out that you don't know, you just go onto Google and most of the answers are there these days. But obviously that wasn't there back then, and if no one else is doing it, the learning process is years, I suppose, and expensive.
Trial and error and expensive. To give you a feeling, we got a crop together, and we thought, what are we going to put it off? So we had a big old barge, and a big concrete barge thing, and we're hanging the ropes off that. Storm come through, sunk the barge, and we lost the bloody lot of it. So all our money went to the bottom of the sea.
So how many years' work was that gone?
It was a couple of years.
Wow.
So after that, we designed fiberglass floats, and my brother being a carpenter, then we built small rafts so that they could handle the tide, the sea, and everything else, unstable as anything. So we would hang the ropes off that. So if you have a look at the first rafts that we built, and they were probably some of the first platforms that went into the Marlborough Sounds. Well, unstable and impossible to work off. You're standing out there, you know, I can show you photographs of it. And then that didn't work, but at least we didn't, you know, we had the crop. We just had to figure out how to get it off. And I can remember we were sitting, you know, if you see mussels on a rope, and we were trying to take the mussels off the rope to get them into a bag so that we could sell them. Bloody near impossible. So I can remember sitting there with my brother in the little fizz boat that we had and absolutely losing my rag in frustration. Being a shearer, I was relatively strong upper body, you know, well muscled. So I can remember grabbing a rope and putting it between my feet and pulling. And the mussels just went, shit. So simple. So we went straight back into Blenheim. We got a little frame up with an eye in it to take the rope. We got a pulley. Harvesting. They still use it today, and it was just that simple.
Wow.
And then I was saying, right, flotation. So it was, we talked about Peter Yearlings. The Yearlings, old Keith Yearlings, he was involved right in the early stages as well. So we would talk backwards and forwards, and we figured that it needed a big buoy, something that was flexible, tied at both ends so that we could hang ropes off. So then Peter started building the buoys, and we become his first clients. Those first buoys, bloody good for a start, but they were weak in their ends, and they started to break up on us. So next one, we had a whole heap of buoys that, weren't actually going the distance. They had to be re-strengthened and so on. So Peter built an industry out of manufacturing the buoys. We had what we wanted, and hence that was aquaculture as we know it for greenshell mussels in the Marlborough Sounds. So we expanded from there, and we just kept going to the point where I think we finished up with 60-odd farms in the end.
Wow.
And
so at what point, because you said at the start, you know, there must be a market for this. So when you started, there's no developed market.
No developed market at all.
So how far along the development and learning track did you go before you actually started thinking, well, we need to find a market for this stuff?
Well, our first market was developed by my brother, and it was with a fish retailer or a guy in Auckland. And so we were selling little sugar bags of mussels to him, and it was going throughout the Maori population in Auckland. But all of a sudden we realised with what we had coming on, we were going to far outproduce that market. We were, too small in New Zealand. So what we were doing was putting them in sugar bags, taking them across the straits by rail, and at Palmerston North, he would come down that far, unload, then distribute going back through the North Island. But we could see with what we had coming on, and all of a sudden, because it was solved, Kiwis are very, very good me too. Once the problem's solved, we're not good at taking the initial risk, but when solved, we will dive into it, and we will always overproduce more than we can consume. So we could see that coming. Then we realised with some of the local fish processors, it was like Georgie Pickering and Blenheim, and we had Tallies and a couple of others. They only had a limited market, and we were looking at a small population inside New Zealand to consume what we had as a bubble. So we could see the bubble coming. What the hell are we going to do with it? We run into it when we couldn't get the homegrown processor to take our product, and we started to get squeezed on price and everything like that. So we have to solve it. We'll have to build our own factory. That again became a major, major hurdle. So we had a fellow, Paul Anderson, who was part of MAF, and Paul was of a great help living in Blenheim. So we talked to Paul a lot with regards to what we had to do to establish a fish processing house and get a license to export. Got most of that solved. Again, we run into it in Wellington, but what we did is run into the fishing industry. They did not want to see any further processors develop facilities inside New Zealand.
Why? What was their beef with that?
Because at that point in time, it was like agricultural top dressing. It was all under license and it was under control. When I was top dressing under Rural and James Aviation, there was no way in hell you could buy an aeroplane and go to work top dressing. It was licensed, it was under control, and if you tried, you finished up in court and you were broken. Car industry was the same. Unless you controlled the import licenses for cars, you couldn't bring a car in. I know my old man, the first car we got, he had to stand in line for 15 months, and he had to prove that he had overseas funds and so on before.
So it's just a complete different mentality than what
different mentality.
Now.
We were government socialist controlled, and it was like there was 2 or 3 groups that had a captive industry and had control of it by way of regulation. So that's what we run into in the fishing industry. So we tried to put a processing house in place, develop the plans, done it according to the rules and so on, but then we needed to make sure that we could get a license to process and export fish. That in itself became a major argument. The funding to build the facility became another argument. So bit by bit, we chipped away at it. In the end, we were promised a license, and we had the section and everything sorted with regards to constructing the facility. But we had to prove to Wellington that we were going to sell the product into the international market without interfering with any other fish processors market. If any of the processors in New Zealand could point to a market that they were in, it was excluded. And if we were seen to go near that, no license. So 2 of us took off into Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, and to America. Never got out of Los Angeles, and had sold everything that we could possibly produce into the international arena. Got drunk in Hawaii for 3 days, come home.
I think you tell a story about some mussel left under a bed in Hawaii.
Oh yeah,
was that trip?
In the Hyatt in Hawaii. We'd sold more than we could produce, so we partied and forgot about the mussels. I can remember in the morning taking the lid off them, and they'd gone off. They'd been flown in. I had the product following me every day fresh. Put it together. So it was Australia, wherever I was, it was coming in Hong Kong and so on. 10 kgs of product. This is what we've got. We got to the point whereby I come back My brother rang me, jet lagged to hell, suffering with a massive hangover. This is the Sunday night. He rang up and he said, there's a meeting called tomorrow in Blenheim. Doug Kidd, the local MP, has got the local fishmongers and processors and so on. They are going to can our application. The objective of this meeting is to put a line through us. We can't get going. Duncan MacIntyre at that point in time was the Minister of Ag and Fish. I lost my rag again. By midday the following day, on the Monday, out of bed and with a reasonable sleep, I got hold of Duncan MacIntyre's secretary. That point in time there was a scandal rag called The Truth, and threatened her that if MacIntyre canned our application, with all the work that we would done, we would run article after article inside The Truth to demonstrate what was happening from Wellington and with the bureaucracy with regards to establishing new business, and kick up such a bloody shit fight that you'll wish to God he'd never met us.
I can see, this runs deep in your personality, fighting for the little man and what's fair. But at any point, did you think this is all just too hard? It's just hurdle after hurdle after hurdle?
No, it was a game. It was just a challenge. It was a game. Well, out of that, we got repositioned. They took us to the point whereby they says, right, we're going to review the application. It won't be cancelled. They took us all the way into, I think it was June. And then we got notice out of Ag and Fish, out of the bureaucracy, yes, they will grant us a license, but these are the terms and conditions. You will have to have constructed your factory between now and the end of September, and you will have had to have demonstrated to us that you've sold the product to a client that is not being serviced by the existing industry. And should that not happen, we will not be granting you a license. You will build the factory for nothing. Now, I have to take my hat off to my brother.
So how many months did that give you to build the factory?
June, July, August and September. It's the end of September, 4 months. From scratch to finish. First product out the door and in a container ready for sale. My brother worked 24 hours a day, and we built that factory. He built it in around about 3 months, and we were up and running in September, and we had the first product out into a container sold to Taiyo in Japan, I think. I need to check with him. Bang, we had our license. And from there, as he said, it just about killed him, but,
There was a funny story you tell about some customers not paying on time, and you'd catch them down in the train carriages.
That was initially. We were distributing out of Palmerston North. We'd have a product sitting in a wagon. Couldn't get them to, we were being long-fingered by a couple of the guys up north. We couldn't get them to come to the party, so we thought, right, we'll sort this one out then. We'll keep sending him the product. He's got to come to the wagon to pick it up. So we sat inside the wagon and waited for him to turn up. He paid.
Yeah, or his knees afterwards.
We'll just say he paid.
So after a lot of dramas with cash flow and investments, Sanfords, you eventually sold the business to New Zealand Salmon Company, correct?
Yes, yep.
And then you got quite involved in that.
So a fellow called Tony Crow had developed a little hatchery at the bottom end of Lake Coleridge, and he'd figured it all out. And so it developed to the point whereby, there was a lot of problems initially from food. I can remember the first salmon we ever cooked. Come out, skinned it was translucent. Didn't look like salmon. It was more like trout. It was white-fleshed. How the hell are we ever going to sell this? It's not pink. So we had to develop a feed factory, and then we had to put dye in the feed to get the meat to look pink.
Do they still do that today?
I think they do. It's not for me to say. But I know when we first tried it, we got it wrong. And we'd be sitting there eating this pink salmon and the bloody dye would be running out on the plate. You'd see. Oh, I couldn't eat it.
Natural product.
Yeah, but we took that all the way from that point to sea ranching. And that, to me, was, the real future of it. But again, we ran into what we would call our bureaucracy. It was a proven technique whereby we released, I think the first release was 10 million smolt to sea at Tent Bridge, just below Lake Ellesmere, down a creek. Built sea pens, cost about 8 million, I think. And that was a gamble, because we said the sea has actually got to be able to feed it. We shouldn't be manufacturing food on shore. We should be releasing to sea and getting them to come back, allow the sea to feed it, and that's farming the sea. And we didn't know whether it worked. Second year, we released, I think it was maybe 8 to 10 million smolt again. Third release, we were running out of money, and it was all to sea. But they come back. And the percentage we needed to come back, they were perfect. You've never seen anything like it. These big salmon coming up this creek into those sea pens, getting spiked and put in a carton and sent off to Japan. Away it went. But who got us? The fishermen got us, because they started trawling up and down in front of the bloody outlet. And going to our own government and saying, look, just give us a chance, embargo it. No, they said, it's open sea, we can't. So we couldn't get it home. So we got wrecked by our own. We got to the point whereby we were arguing about saying, well, just pay us and we'll release and the fishermen can catch it, but we've got to get income to ensure that we can feed it. Couldn't do it.
Can you talk about the Asparagus Drama?
Well,
just briefly, because that sort of morphed into another whole industry, didn't it? The food importing.
Well, unbeknown to some of the directors in Salmon Company, the opportunity to buy into an asparagus company was put before the board, and a few of the members decided it was a great opportunity, knew nothing about it, and got involved. And this was going to be, it was the gold, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Brand new, another sunrise industry. So that was fine, away it went, and then I think I'd finished up in Australia and farting around there, but I got a ring when I was in Cairns, a long story short, saying that we're in all sorts of shit in the UK with regards to our asparagus. What do you mean in the shit? Well, we can't sell it. 300 tonne of asparagus. Go up there and sell it, just get rid of it. We've got to get it off our books. I'm sitting in the Grosvenor Hotel, and it was 8 o'clock at night. Phone goes. It's the CEO of Nestle saying, you're in here to sort out the asparagus thing? Yes. You have until Wednesday to get 150 tonne of product out of our cool stores, or it's on the street. Within 30 minutes, the CEO of Wold Edwards and Walkden rang us. You've got 150 tonne of asparagus sitting in our cool stores. You've got till Wednesday to get rid of it, or it's on the street. We can't sell it. So what the hell is going wrong? Then I got another phone call from a trader saying, we hear that you've got a distressed parcel of asparagus. I'll give you £30,000 for it. He was an Irishman. If you knew what we'd spent, £30,000, oh, we were dead. So, jet-lagged and so on, I started on that Wednesday morning, met with the CEOs, and then it dawned on me that our parcel was big enough to upset the international market. Most of the asparagus coming into the UK was coming out of Spain, Chile and China, Taiwan. White asparagus, green asparagus. But the market had stalled. Everybody knew that there was a distressed package out of New Zealand that had the ability to tip it. So nobody was moving, and I thought, there's a chance. It's jammed. So you had to work your way through that to have a look at cause and effect. We'd caused the problem, but it was much bigger than who we were. So, little bit by little bit, we negotiated a position with both companies. It took me about 6 weeks, and finally we had a deal. What had got us was our packaging and processing was so bad that it was all in 200-gram packs. But some of those packs were 180 grams, some were 210, and so on. It was all over the show.
Right.
Weights and Measures in the UK had the ability to bring a charge against you out of every county based on the fact that you were, you'd broken the rules. So at worst, there was 50 court cases sitting there. So we had to untangle it. Now that's a long story. I could write a book on it. But it was about 18 months later, the problem had disappeared with the help of the guys in the UK and what we'd put together to solve the problem. And instead of £30,000, come back with 1.8 million.
Wow. And you could have given that away for 30,000 quid.
Yes. But from that, sitting there working and trading with them, you've seen and identified other opportunities.
And that's what I found interesting out of that story, because that Irishman, that was Dick Murphy, right?
Yep.
So the guy that offered you 30,000 quid became a great mate and a business partner.
Yes.
Which is pretty cool.
Yep, because he was the trader. So we finished up. I was in Ireland, still working the asparagus problem, and I was sitting there after his banter and chat, and I started to think about it, and I rang him up about a fortnight later and says, "Hey, I got a name for the company." He said, "What's that?" I said, "We'll call it Neylon." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It's easy to say, easy to advertise. It doesn't mean anything, so it's us." He said, Neylon.
Murphy and Neylon.
Yeah, Murlon, Neylon. So we registered the company called Neylon, and away we went and we started trading. So that introduced us to Ross Young and Allied Lions and other people that I started to deal with. So from Ross Young, we were working distressed product, chocolate gatto cakes that were freezer burnt. Now, freezer burnt big chocolate gatto has just got we say it's freezer burnt, but it's just got ice over the top of it and so on. So all it needs is a bit of sunshine. So we were taking chocolate gatto cakes down to the market, buying them for shit off Ross Young, taking them down to the market, down and the various little Saturday morning and Sunday morning markets, opening the box up, the sun would come on, perfect gattos. Some of them for a bloody fortune.
It's crazy what one little opportunity opens up. I wrote, correct me if I'm wrong, but I wrote a list of what you imported over the years: fish, mussels, squid, prawns, all from New Zealand.
The prawns were out of Thailand.
Right. Eels from Taiwan, lobster from Western Australia.
Yes.
And you imported it into UK, including Ireland and Scotland, Germany, Switzerland, France, including Buckingham Palace.
We were selling New Zealand sole caught out of the Otago Harbour to Buckingham Palace as Dover soles for a premium. Wow. So I'm not going to tell you the margins because I think Merv might be dead now.
No,
He'd kill me.
I mean, good on you. You saw an opportunity, you're out there, giving it a crack, and you deserve whatever you got.
Yeah. Well, it was just part of the fun.
Yeah.
Just about wrecked my marriage to the point whereby I was spending most of the time. I can remember, my wife rang me at one stage. She said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm in the UK." She said, "You were here last night." I caught the 6:30 flight out of Invercargill and was gone.
So you sold your New Zealand salmon shares just prior to the stock market crash?
Yes.
So from there, you go from one sunrise industry to another into the sheep milking, which takes up, I don't know, is it 20 years of your life?
Yes. Well, I got talked into that. It was to solve a problem, and I was like sitting there saying, some guys had invested into it. They got us to have a look at it, and there was a friend actually got me to go and have a real look. They'd poured some cash in, and it was breaking. And looked at it, researched it, I thought, holy hell, there is something here. Because me and sheep's milk have being a shearer and saying, look, would you ever drink, I didn't like milk anyway, would you ever drink sheep's milk? Not in your bloody living daylight would I try sheep's milk. But then I started to try a couple of the products, a bit of what the French were producing and so on. I thought, hang on, we've missed something. And then when you went through the Middle East, Saudi, Iran and so on, whoops, this is a real old product. The cow is a new one. It's only there by way of volume. Let's have a look inside it and see what it is. And so when you measured it against everything else, you could see the value that sat inside it, just the health benefits alone.
You wrote an interesting thing on this line about when you first started sheep milking and somebody asked, why sheep? And you said, my answer was that I hated them when I was shearing them, but looking back, I realised we had missed something. Look around, you'll see it's not all meat and wool, it's milk, meat and wool, 3 income streams. This humble animal was one of God's greatest gifts to man, and it's taken me nearly 50 years to realise it.
And I stand by that today, and I still think that today. The reality is, I made a mistake, big mistake, by trying to do it here. It should have been done in the States, or the other place it should have been done probably before then was in Australia.
This is looking now in hindsight, you're saying?
Even at the time, I knew, sitting in the back of my brain, I knew, based on previous dealings, that this was going to be a massive punt, I should say. And then I had to start looking at what you know and what you've been taught by what you would call an international market, outside the isolation of New Zealand. And then looking at Asia and looking at China more specifically. I wasn't really used to milk and the benefits of it. And then saying, hang on, if I'm sitting in Colac, just in Victoria, south of Geelong, and having a look at how that functions, both in dry and wet seasons through the winter and summer, and I thought, hell, it fits. Colac in Australia, I could run this 12 months of the year just on the growth cycles and climate. And the bit that really got me was sitting there saying, hey, there's the railway line straight up to Darwin, into market, and everything.
So what you're saying is the challenges of the Kiwi attitude and the isolation,
yes,
and all the problems New Zealand brings would have been overcome by doing it in a different...
Yeah. A commercial brain would have says, don't do it here, even though you could see all the attributes. Then you had to have a look at the people you're dealing with and their ability to change. And knowing full well that you've been down that path, and knowing full well that you have to prove it before such time as the Kiwi will move. But he has this habit of sitting there saying, won't take the risk, but once it's solved, me too. And we will dive in head first into a shallow pool, hit our heads. Take the mussel industry. Once we got that solved, you've got no idea how much capital flew in from what we called the Queen Street investors. People investing into the industry based on tax relief. The cash that flew in was ginormous. The only thing
was the same, wasn't it?
And it's exactly the same. And once proven, what we do is we dive in. Then, being such a small country, have the ability to overproduce product for our own markets. Then we race offshore, trying to save our own bacon with a product that we've done no marketing with, trying to find a spot or a home for it. And then our behaviour inside the selling arena is such that we come back to what you would call a producer mentality.
So, a couple of questions. Firstly, what's the, the marketing value of sheep milk from New Zealand must be huge, though. If you did it in the States, you don't have that green value. Is that worth something?
It is worth something, but at the end of the day, what you've got to understand is what each market will stand in volume. It's like we developed some excellent cheeses that were world award winning, both in New York awards and the London awards. So internationally we've done extremely well, but doesn't mean a shit here. So we eat cheddar. So next cab off the rank, we'll go to Australia. Well, Australia's one of the hardest markets in the world to crack if you're a Kiwi, because they want to do themselves. So you ask the apple boys, you try and get New Zealand apples into Australia. So then you go and have a look at various communities, and you can say, well, hang on, Chinese have never had milk. Let's have a look at what's happening to them once they get onto milk. They start to grow. It's healthy. And you're looking at 1.4 billion. What percentage of that population are we? It's a scratch. So let's understand it. But don't look at China. Have a look at Asia. You're looking at Thailand. You're looking at Singapore. You're looking at Malaysia. You're looking at Indonesia. Add that together and figure out as a culture where you sit. And then you'll also see the opportunity with regards to what we have. But then you have to have a good look at ourselves with regards to our ability to develop it.
And this, I think, was what I picked up was one of your biggest problems. I mean, you got the product up and running, you found customers, but you just couldn't deliver anything like what they wanted.
Yes. Well, I told you about Blue River Dairy. You never hear of Blue River Dairy now, but if I told you that it was one of the biggest manufacturers of sheep milk products in Australasia, you'd say bullshit. But that product, the sheep milk powder, is coming in from Italy, Sardinia, France, Spain, and so on. And it's being turned into the infant formula that we developed. And it's being sold into China as a product of New Zealand.
So we're not going to have time to go right into it all here, but from my understanding, and maybe we can talk about some of the challenges you had getting the industry up and running and milking 20,000 sheep a day. But you developed the product, you sold it to China. There were a lot of political issues getting approvals, and then you sold the factory and the entire product back to China.
We developed the product lines, we done the promotions, we released into the Chinese or the Asian markets. Our next cab off the rank, providing we had the volume, was Indonesia. Then we stalled with regards to having the political will and ability to sort out what was going on in China, and then you had to survive that. We actually released the formula into China on the 26th of April, I forget the year, walked out of there with deposits on the next 3 years' production. On the 2nd of May, there was a rule change. So then we had to work with our own people.
A rule change from the Chinese.
From the Chinese, but what they were trying to impose on New Zealand was draconian. It affected the meat industry and it affected Fonterra, affected the whole lot. And we appeared not to have the ability to sort that. So there was a whole lot of issues that run onto that. So we functioned right up until Christmas, and we were working with Landcorp. And it was going to take somebody of their size to actually help develop it, because the industry wasn't what we were doing. The industry was based on what we had by way of sheep and what they could add to the overall economy. Our mistake was that we went too big with regards to what it was, but we needed the volume to go to market, and nobody else was producing it. So we couldn't get the support from what we call our rural base. So in the end, based on our behaviour, looking at the industry and saying, we can't take it any further, so I sold it to the Chinese. So 23rd of January was the Landcorp boy says, no, we're out. By the 15th of February, I'd sold the company. I sold it straight to the Chinese and says, look, you might as well do it. They changed the operation, took the infant formula and all the development and promotion that we'd done, to the point that they spent another 150 million on the factory. But you do not hear about it here.
What did that feel like, selling to the Chinese after all those years of development? And did it feel like selling your soul?
No, it didn't. It was just taking a pragmatic look at it and understanding where we sat relative to what was available, and then trying to bring that group forward to actually pick the industry up and run with it. And then having been involved in the meat industry and so on, and also watching Fonterra and how they operate, all of a sudden gives you a feeling of, that's fine, we can produce it, just give us some money. Instead of saying, right, you know, you've got Fonterra and its brands that have been developed. I think they're selling them off at the moment. So everything they've talked about over the last 25 years with regards to brands, marketing and, you know, retaining value, they're going against it. They're selling their brands off, the very thing that develops and allows them to control cash flow. He who controls brand and market controls the money flow. So here we are, becoming subservient to it again.
So you mentioned that all the sheep milk powder now comes from Italy, offshore European farms. Yeah. And all Blue River is now is a processing factory that turns European sheep milk powder into infant formula and sells it to China with a Blue River dairy name, correct?
Blue River dairy name. When we started promoting Blue River dairy in China, it was so successful. Chinese rang us on the basis of saying, shit, we're going to have to try and do something about that. Why? There was 200 different companies had registered the brand, and they were using Blue River for selling shirts, T-shirts, other milk powders. And in fact, we run into guys that were cutting from the internet, from our web page, cutting the our packaging and wrapping it around tins and trying to sell. And is that product.
Because they knew it was New Zealand related, or just the term Blue River sounds
New Zealand has some of the best products in the world as far as I'm concerned.
So that name was associated with New Zealand?
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Blue River. We had a company called Shanghai Blue River. Put a lot into developing the markets for it and so on.
So it just seems very sad that 25 odd years later, everything that was developed and up and running, which seems like it must have been so good for Southland and for the sheep industry in New Zealand, is now not there.
We had, the stock that we had developed, were giving us around about a 230% lambing rate. 20,000 ewes were producing something like about 56,000 lambs. And we had them going all year round. There's a story on that, how we developed a breeding cycle to go for 12 months. September, October and November were the worst because we couldn't get the ewes to ovulate. But we finally figured out how to do that as well. And so we were fattening lambs off from a 3 kg birth weight, and 21 days had them up to 15 kgs, slaughtering them at a 53% yield, 7.5 kgs. Just a bit better. Some of the best product ever. So I was selling them into Saudi Arabia and so on at $18 a kilo as milk lambs. But it was threatening, in my mind, it was threatening the existing sheep industry and the infrastructure that we had in place based on fat lambs. So for me, it was a step too far to try and drag people across the line. We had a plan to do it, but it was going to take too long to implement.
But every new product is threatening another one that's already established.
Yeah. All we were doing was taking it to another level, because we were coming back to what a ewe could produce by way of milk, meat and wool. Milk being the primary product. And instead of, 150 odd bucks a ewe based on 150% lambing, we were putting something in there like 300 litres of milk off a good ewe at $3 a litre. That was another $900 by way of earn. But it took management. It created employment, and it gives you the income to make you more profitable than the existing industry. Had we taken it to the point whereby people could see it more clearly, we would have had another Me Too. And people would have Kiwis would have dived into it, I'm sure of it.
Yeah. What was your experience like dealing with the Chinese?
Excellent. People on the ground, great. Like the greatest or the best clients I've ever had in my life. First, the Japanese. Secondly, the Swiss. And the Chinese were right up there with them. But it was understanding the Chinese. The Chinese will test you because, like you and I have a definition of family that says mum, dad, the kids, uncles and aunties. Chinese will look at you to the point whereby if they are working with you, you become family, but they have to be able to trust you and you them, and they will test you on the way through. And it's a matter of when you're settling a price, you'll get the price home providing you're prepared to take some responsibility if they get into trouble with trying to achieve it on your behalf. And likewise, if you're prepared to do that, from what I found out, they will assist you if you're in trouble, trying to service them.
And you found them trustworthy and honest as long as you were...
Never had a bad debt.
Doing the same?
Cash was good. Trade was great. Everything paid for before such time it was unloaded off the ships. Never an issue. Deposits up front.
You had a woman called Morning
Go.
I don't know how to pronounce her last name. So obviously having a local was important in markets
Morning
like that.
Go has got such talent. She should have been on the New Zealand honours list with regards to her skill sets in China and being able to develop contacts and outlets. She is unbelievably good. But she's a Chinese girl living in New Zealand.
Oh, she still lives in New Zealand.
She would be the heart and soul of the New Zealand velvet industry by way of deer. She has done more for deer farming in New Zealand by way of byproducts than I would say than anybody else. But having said that, you will never get the rest of the industry to admit to how good she is.
At the end of this whole chapter on the sheep milking in Blue River, you said, for me the disappointment is that in New Zealand we have a Garden of Eden with our primary sector, but we've not made a very good job of maximising the full value of the sector. Sheep milking has been the biggest challenge for me amongst some stiff competition from venison, mussels and salmon. One common thread in all of this has been the development and new product initiatives have come from outside of each of those sectors rather than within. All such interesting journeys.
Well, yeah, in my mind, the only thing that we've demonstrated is that we don't have the ability to do it just yet. It still sits there. But as a small nation and as a group of people, we've got quite a long way to go to actually ensure that we develop what we've got in what you would call a sustainable base. And having been a pilot and been having, I suppose, the good fortune to travel up and down most valleys in New Zealand at least half a dozen to a dozen times a year when you're flying helicopters, you actually see the resources, you see what's sitting there. And then by travelling and having a look elsewhere, you understand what we have relative to everybody else. But that when you come back and have a look at our ability and our internal skill sets with regards to developing that, you start shaking your head. You'll get to the point whereby you can identify small pockets of people that have those absolute skill sets. But more often than not, they've got to go offshore to develop because we can't sustain it here. We haven't got what you would call the intellectual capacity to actually see it, take the punt to develop it. We go, me too. The other thing that sits out there is the sickle. The tall poppy syndrome here is still alive and well. We've got to get over it.
And you talk a bit about our attitudes to success in New Zealand, or our negative attitudes to success.
Yes, because what we have to do, it's like a socialist attitude. We have to bring it back down to a level that we're happy with and understand.
We don't really like people making a profit in New Zealand, do we?
No, and we think that, like we've not got the ability to look after ourselves. We couldn't even. If the Chinese boys started to come down here and says, like, we want New Zealand, they'd take it because we don't have the skill sets or the ability to actually retain it. We depend on others. And I don't say that out of bitterness. I say that out of a fact of saying, for God's sake, have a look at ourselves, understand what we've got. We could be the richest nation in the world on the resources. We let so much go to waste, and we will crash it rather than watch it grow or help develop it. Those that succeed, and you can say Tim Wallace was one of them and so on, there's been some brilliant entrepreneurs come out of New Zealand, but have a look at how fast we go me too, without risk. Go search for the capital for a new adventure in New Zealand, or venture. It's scarce. And
you also talk about our short-term view of profitability. We need to have ventures profitable instantly, whereas I think you said in China they have like a 30-year view of success.
30-year horizon, something that we can't compete with. We need instant gratification.
I think we've only touched the surface of what you've done in your life, and I've written a few other things just for the sake of mentioning them, but you've farmed up to 50,000 deer.
Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
That was New Zealand Deer Farms. Our internal herd was about 25,000.
Right. Yep. You have done dairy cow farming.
Yeah, at one stage we were milking about 5,000 cows.
You won the Export Southland Awards in 2024.
Yeah, where they got that from, I'm not too sure.
Hey, you got to take it.
Yeah.
You're very big into horse racing.
I was.
You were?
Yeah.
You had a horse won a race in 2006.
In Melbourne Cup Day.
In Melbourne Cup Day at Flemington.
Yeah, we had it set for the Cup. We wanted him in as a lightweight. He had a devastating sprint. Yeah, he could sprint for 1,000 metres. He was a great stayer called Southern Courage. And we were lining up for the draw for the Melbourne Cup. We knew that we were going to be number 23, 22, and that was about it. We were going to be the last, and we lined up for the draw, mate and I, and thought, yep, we're in, paid up. Trainer says, there's always a scratching. We're in. No scratching that year. So we lined him up in what they called the levats. That's for the horses that missed.
Right.
I won that by about 5 or 6 lengths. Just run home. Best day I've ever had at the races. Pocket full of cash.
And another interesting thing I read in the back of your book, between 2004 and 2008, you rode your motorbike right around Australia in 3 or 4 different goes.
Yep.
It was a pretty cool trip.
One of the best trips of my life.
Was that just a bucket list item?
A bucket list item. I'd always looked at it and kept looking at Australia. Think it's a magnificent country. Unbelievable, the resources. Steph, wife, out of an office in Christchurch, very conservative, threw her on the back of it just with a roll bag and so on. She managed to sneak in a hairdryer and we took off. So it was right round the outside. It was about 33 to 35,000 Ks, but couldn't believe how rich that place is, the diversity. And you know, you have a look at the mineral wealth. You're looking at the coal that comes out. We rode out of Mackay, got to a place called Sabina, and here was a coal train went past. So I figured that there was a road inland. I said, we'll follow the railway track. Got into Claremont, passed 4 trains, and they all had 100-odd wagons on the back, loaded with coal going straight out to sea. Then seen the same down in Newcastle, ships lined up to take the coal out. My brother-in-law, who was part of Bechtel and also part of BHP in Western Australia, I used to argue with him, and I said, how can you be so crazy? What do you mean? I said, here you are shipping thousands of tons of coal out of Australia straight up to China, and yet you've implemented a carbon tax on yourselves. I said, you've got to be mad. And I said, having a look at the iron ore that's coming out of the Pilbara, and that was part of riding round, and seeing that, I said, you're going to throw the world out of balance. Those trains are so big. I said, I'm in aviation. I said, its weight and balance is going to go wrong. You're going to tip it because it's all going into China. I said, so they're burning it and manufacturing it, and you're taxing yourself for it. I said, that to me is, you've got to be bloody idiots.
Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
Doesn't make sense at all. So I said, it's political bullshit. So you'd have great arguments. But having seen the Ord water scheme, river scheme, in the top end of Western Australia, it's bigger than Cook Strait. It's about 35 k's across and probably about 40 k's long. Fresh water. And you look at it and you think, my God, you could pipe that to bloody Perth. You haven't got water issues. I think what we noticed riding around on a motorbike, especially out in the middle, was that we'd ride, riding up the road and a car would be coming towards us. The driver would be awake and the passenger would be asleep. And you'd see the odd tourist bus coming past, the driver awake and all the passengers were asleep. And then you'd talk to them and say, oh, it's bloody boring. On a motorbike, you could smell it, see it, and you'd see all the subtle changes. Yeah. Magnificent country, great people, heaps of laughs.
Cool.
Richest country in the world. It's got to be.
I've got a couple of last questions. You mentioned when we met the other day that you do a wee bit of business mentoring. Are there fundamental issues or key things that you try and instill in new or prospective business owners?
Yes. Some of them is understanding your own capabilities, seeing your dream, and putting your plan in place to try and achieve it. Don't overstretch it. Make sure you're comfortable and enjoy it. Learn how to smile and go for the ride.
Now, I'm assuming this is Keith talking from, 30 years later after you've made all these mistakes. Is that right?
Yes. Because I said, well, what we've got the ability to do is get very excited on first success, and that gives you a push to the point whereby you will overstretch. And then you will spend a fair amount of time trying to get yourself balanced up again. And if you're not strong enough, you'll buckle. But if you do buckle, what you will run into is not American, it's Kiwi. So understand that bigger picture, get a feel for it, and it'll become a sixth sense to you. You'll see it. So enjoy the trip, plan well, and then monitor it, because you don't get the same chances in New Zealand. You go bankrupt in New Zealand, you are a prick. You go bankrupt in America, at least you've had a go, and they'll give you a chance to have another go. You could go down 7 times, but when you win, you're a hero. Not here. So just be careful. Understand the environment you work in, and make sure you can operate within your capacity, and understand who your competition is, and how it's going to behave if you get too close to it. Basic, simple principles.
But all quite big picture things too, which often I guess people miss because they're so involved in the nitty gritty of what they think they're good at and can sell.
They allow it to go by. They don't step back long enough. It's like saying a good manager has to make sure that he's got time up his sleeve. So don't work 12 hours a day. Remember, 8 to sleep, 8 to rest, 8 to work. Keep that one if you're a manager, and make sure you've got spare capacity. So if it's a 5-day week, make sure that you're going 4 and you've got 1 spare, because you never know when you're going to be called. And you can guarantee If somebody's thrown a bucket of shit over you, there is 2 more around the corner that you don't see. Make sure that you're in condition to handle that.
What do you look for when you're employing new staff? Because you did mention at one point that you don't place a lot of importance on educational qualifications all the time.
No, I don't.
And a lot of the people you're interacted with seem to be a gut feeling.
It is a gut feeling. What you're doing is looking at the person, looking at natural skill sets, and you're seeing, it's like saying if you're interviewing a person with regards to marketing and so on, you know that's an art form, so get them to draw a picture. And just say, right, you have to have a degree of skill with regards to recognising art and what people realise is good art. It can't be taught. More often than not, good marketers are born. And it's like saying, right, I'll take you out as, we'll have a look at a drafter working for a stock firm, and I'll take a mathematician out of the university and I'll say there's 3,000 lambs. Take all the 16.5 kilos out for me. The mathematician will get his scales out and take them one by one through the facility, weigh them, and he'll give you absolute accuracy. The good stock agent will take the 3,000 lambs, run them at a gate, and within 13 minutes you will have a range of between 6.5 and a bit more. He'll do it by eye. He's born to it, he can see it, and so on. So don't forget to recognise the natural skill sets. It's not all about education. It's about a balance.
You mentioned, just going back a step, with Blue River when you were marketing, most people I've worked with in marketing, especially if they have a degree, are very good at promoting themselves, selling you a concept, selling you packaging, but not very good at selling the product.
Run into that a number of times.
But I think your daughter Justine took over the marketing and just learnt the business like the back of her hand.
She did. One of the first people that we had was a Dutch girl. She was absolutely brilliant. So Justine's worked with me all my life through the mussels and so on. She's got a natural feel for it. She just has. And so those two together come up with simplicity, and they produce stuff that attracted people. Like if you have a look at the Blue River brand, it's like a 5-year-old's put it together. It's just a small BLUE in boxes and shapes and colours that relate to what we're doing. And it was easy to build a story off the back of it. Yeah. It didn't cost a fortune.
It's quite subtle, isn't it?
It's just subtle.
Mm. If you compare society back then, in the decades that you've been doing all your stuff, do you think there was more opportunities back then, before there were so many rules and regulations, or are there plenty of new opportunities these days?
To me, we haven't touched it. There's stacks of opportunities. The only thing that precludes us from having a crack at them is how we've regulated ourselves out of it. Instead of encouraging people to have a crack and making sure that it's not going to do damage to both community or environment, and building off the back of that with knowledge, we sit there and put too much up front in place, and it becomes a hurdle, and it becomes difficult. And so therefore sometimes I look at it and think maybe the major corporates have got too much to do with it, to the point whereby it's in their best interest with regards to a monopoly attitude to ensure that it's very hard to get in and compete. What you're doing is then knocking out all the young people coming through with very good ideas, because you break them before such time as they can actually get their capital into the business. You take a young guy trying to build a house, by the time he gets all the consents in place between government and so on, he's burnt his deposit up, and then he's got to employ the carpenter and so on. Well, business is very much like that. Anybody that's got a monopoly and is protected by regulation, it's in their best interest to create regulation to maintain the protection. That does not help you develop. You can't burn your young people off by way of regulation, because you kill them. We survive based on our young people and their ability to produce and develop. You realise that when you get into your 60s, because at the end of the day they're paying for you, because all the social benefit taxes that you've paid in the past have been well spent. So, at your peril, keep regulating, knocking the young people over, knocking their opportunities over, and then when you get to collecting your pension and there's nothing there, have a bloody good look at yourself, because you've actually created the circumstances.
Couldn't agree more. Do you have any regrets in life?
Not one.
Apart from not doing more ag flying.
That's the only one. I should have stayed, if you asked me, I've got a job tomorrow, what do you want to do? I'd be an ag pilot.
All right, Keith, thanks very much for talking to me. It's been a bit of a marathon, but I appreciate your time and your expertise and your historical stories, which are great.
Yeah. Well, I hope I haven't bored you.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thanks for the time. I've enjoyed it.